Hey guys, tonight we're setting foot in the restless, rain-slicked streets of Dublin in the early 2000s, when the city's underworld was shifting like the tide, and a young man named Eamon Dunne was about to rise faster than anyone thought possible. Picture neon bleeding across puddles, the muffled hum of late-night taxis, and the invisible lines that split the Northside from everywhere else. Out here, opportunity didn't knock politely. It came wrapped in whispered offers and backroom handshakes. You probably won't survive this world if you don't know the rules, and even then, the rules have a way of changing overnight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Dublin of Eamon Dunne's youth was a city in transition. On the surface, the Celtic Tiger economy had injected prosperity into its veins, glass-fronted buildings sprouting where old factories once stood, high-end boutiques replacing corner shops, and the skyline flashing with cranes like a city mid-renovation. But in the underbelly, the old order was shifting. The long-reigning gangland hierarchies, built in the late 1980s and early 1990s, were showing cracks. Some of the most notorious figures of the previous generation were gone, locked away, on the run, or lying under cold headstones in Glasnevin. In their place came a younger breed. They were bolder, more connected to the global drug market, and far less bound by the cautious codes of the older bosses. Eamon, born and raised in the heart of Dublin's Northside, was one of them. He grew up in an area where respect was currency, reputation was armor, and every move you made was weighed by who was watching. Even as a teenager, people noticed how quickly he adapted, how he could switch from a quiet, watchful presence to a decisive operator when it mattered. Many people still think that his rise was a simple matter of luck. Right place, right time, right contacts. But those who knew him in those days say it was never just luck. It was calculation. He understood the rhythm of the streets in a way most people never would. He didn't talk more than he had to, and when he did, he spoke with a confidence that made people lean in. The shift in Dublin's underworld wasn't just about who was running the show. It was about how the business was done. The older generation operated like neighborhood chiefs. They controlled turf, demanded tribute, and kept disputes relatively quiet. The new wave, Eamon's wave, saw the potential in expanding beyond the city's narrow limits. Drugs weren't just moving from one pub to another. They were arriving in shipping containers from Spain, from the Netherlands, from South America. Connections were no longer just about knowing a local smuggler. They were about having a contact in Rotterdam, a driver in Antwerp, a fixer in Malaga. Eamon's early years in crime reflected that change. He wasn't tied down to one patch of ground. He moved between neighborhoods, made friends with rival crews, and learned which bridges to build and which to burn. His first jobs weren't glamorous. Small courier runs, standing watch during meetings, passing along messages that didn't need to be written down. But these were the stepping stones every serious operator had to take. What set him apart wasn't just ambition. It was his ability to read a situation in seconds. If a deal felt wrong, he'd walk away, no matter how tempting the payoff. If he saw an opening for an alliance, he'd take it, even if it meant swallowing pride. This instinct would later define the way he built his crew, men who trusted his judgment enough to follow orders without hesitation. The Dublin of the early 2000s was buzzing with possibilities for someone like Eamon. The older bosses underestimated him, seeing only a young man without the scars or the years to prove himself. But on the streets, youth wasn't a weakness. It was speed, adaptability, the ability to blend in with the nightlife and move unnoticed. He could be in a nightclub one night, rubbing shoulders with footballers and pop singers, and the next morning, he'd be in a backroom pub with seasoned criminals, negotiating the delivery of a shipment worth more than most people's homes. One of the key shifts in these years was the rise of new money in the drug trade. Cocaine had overtaken heroin as the drug of choice among Dublin's middle and upper classes. Demand was exploding, and the profit margins were astronomical. Eamon saw this change before many others did. While older crews still focused heavily on heroin distribution, he began positioning himself in the cocaine market, knowing the clientele was bigger spending and, importantly, less likely to draw the kind of community outrage that heroin did. It's worth noting that the Gardaí, Dublin's police force, were also changing tactics in these years. They had learned from the bloody gangland wars of the 1990s that public shootouts brought political heat, so they began targeting financial records, communication lines, and smuggling routes. For a young operator like Eamon, that meant being careful with visible assets. He didn't flash stacks of cash or wear jewelry that screamed untouchable wealth. Instead, he let his reputation grow quietly, investing in relationships and influence rather than gold chains and sports cars. At least in these early years, there's a memory, passed around by those who knew him back then, of a night in a Northside pub. Two older gangsters, drunk and boasting, were talking about who would take over the streets in the coming years. Eamon, sitting at the bar, didn't say a word, but when one of them turned to him and asked if he thought he could handle that kind of power, he simply smiled and replied, "If it's going spare, I'll take it." The room went quiet for a second, and then everyone laughed. But some remembered the way he said it, like it wasn't a joke at all. By his early 20s, Eamon had built a network that stretched beyond the Northside. Friends in the port, contacts in nightclubs, allies among lower-level dealers who respected his fair treatment. He wasn't known for undercutting his own people or cheating them out of their share. A rare trait in a world where betrayal was often just another business move. At the same time, he wasn't naive. He knew that in Dublin's gangland, trust had an expiration date. Deals could turn sour overnight, and allies could become enemies faster than a pint could be poured. That's why he kept his inner circle small in these early days, leaning on a handful of people he'd grown up with, men who understood not just the business, but the loyalty it required. This first phase of his rise was marked by patience. While some young gangsters tried to make a name with big, flashy moves, pulling high-profile robberies, staging violent takeovers, Eamon played the long game. He let others draw the Gardaí's attention while he quietly expanded, moving product in higher quantities, making sure the right people owed him favors. It was also in these years that he began to shape the persona that would later make him one of Dublin's most talked-about figures. Calm, clean-cut, polite in conversation. He didn't fit the stereotype of the loud, aggressive street boss. To outsiders, he could pass for a businessman, maybe a nightclub manager, someone respectable enough to shake hands with politicians at charity events. But those in the know understood that this calm exterior was just another tool, one that let him operate in spaces where more obvious criminals couldn't go. Eamon's rise was not without challenges. There were crews who saw his growing influence as a threat, and whispers that he was moving in on territory that wasn't his. but he handled these threats with the same measured approach that had brought him this far. Sometimes that meant a quiet meeting to settle misunderstandings. Other times, it meant showing enough force to make sure the misunderstanding didn't happen again. Looking back, many say these early years were when he laid the foundation for everything that followed. The connections made, the lessons learned, the discipline shown, they were all part of a careful build towards something bigger. And in Dublin's shifting underworld, bigger was always just around the corner. By the mid-2000s, his name was starting to be mentioned in conversations that once belonged to older, more established figures. The city's underworld had indeed shifted, and young Eamon was not just riding the wave. He was helping to shape it. The first taste of crime for Eamon Dunne wasn't the cinematic heist or the thunderous gang war that most people imagine when they think of Dublin's underworld. It was smaller, quieter, and, like most beginnings, built on necessity rather than glory. Dublin's Northside in the late 1980s and early 1990s was a place where opportunities were scarce for young men without connections in legitimate business. Jobs were limited, and for those growing up in certain neighborhoods, the path toward making money often ran parallel to the law. Not within it, Eamon, like many of his generation, found himself surrounded by small-time hustlers before he was even old enough to understand the mechanics of their trade. There were the men who sold counterfeit sports jerseys from the back of vans, the lads who could get you a discount on electronics that had fallen off a truck, and the neighborhood figures who could find any substance you were looking for, so long as you knew how to ask. This was the ecosystem that raised him, a place where you learned early to spot the difference between a real opportunity and a trap. His very first job in this shadow economy was as a lookout. It was unremarkable in every way, except for the fact that it introduced him to the pulse of street work. He stood on a corner, outside a small convenience shop, watching for signs of garde while two older boys sorted the contents of a delivery truck parked in the alley. The job paid almost nothing, a few quid and a promise of more next time, but it gave him something he hadn't had before, a role in the machine. He wasn't just another face in the neighborhood anymore. He was someone the older lads trusted enough to bring along. In these moments, Eamon began to pick up the unwritten rules. Don't talk too much. Don't ask unnecessary questions. And always, always remember who you owe. Debt in this world wasn't just about money. It was about favors, protection, and silence. These early lessons would later keep him alive when others in his position made fatal mistakes. By his late teens, Eamon had graduated from lookouts to running small errands for neighborhood operators. Sometimes it was delivering a package, never opening it, never asking what was inside. Other times, it was ferrying envelopes stuffed with cash across the city. These jobs carried more risk, but also more reward. He was learning the geography of Dublin in a way few taxi drivers even knew. Every backstreet, every shortcut, every pub where certain conversations were held in hushed tones. One story that floats around from these years involves a late-night errand gone wrong. Eamon had been sent to deliver a package to a man in a southside apartment complex. The man wasn't home, and instead, Eamon found himself face-to-face with two strangers who claimed to be friends of the intended recipient. In this moment, many young runners might have panicked, handing over the package to avoid trouble or trying to bluff their way through. Eamon didn't. He simply said, "No problem, I'll come back later," and walked away. What he didn't know at the time, but learned later, was that the two strangers were there to intercept the package on behalf of a rival crew. His caution that night saved him from walking straight into a theft that could have ended his career before it began. This was the defining quality of Eamon's early criminal work. He learned from everything. Every delivery, every pub conversation, every tense stare from a rival taught him something. While others in his age group often got caught up in the excitement, the money, the parties, the status, Eamon treated it like an education. The city was his classroom, and every alleyway was a lesson in survival. As the 2000s approached, the scale of opportunities began to shift. The Celtic Tiger economy was in full swing, and the money circulating through Dublin wasn't just in legitimate industries. The nightlife scene was exploding. New clubs, flashier bars, and a growing appetite for drugs among the city's middle and upper classes. Cocaine was no longer a rare luxury. It was becoming as common in certain circles as a pint of beer. This boom trickled down into the neighborhoods, creating demand that ambitious young operators like Eamon could not ignore. His first real break into this market came through a cousin who was loosely connected to a nightclub owner on the Northside. The club had a steady clientele of wealthy regulars, many of whom wanted more than just drinks and music. Eamon started as the quiet man in the background, occasionally stepping outside with a customer and returning with a discreet handshake. But within months, he became the go-to guy for reliable, discreet supply. It wasn't glamorous. He wasn't sitting at VIP tables with bottles of champagne, at least not yet. Most of his nights were spent moving between clubs, pubs, and street corners, always with the sense that the right opportunity was just around the corner. And in many ways, it was. His reliability and discretion began to draw attention, not just from customers, but from bigger players who saw potential in a young man who could handle himself without drawing unnecessary heat. Many people still think that his rise during these years was the result of older gangsters taking him under their wing. While there's some truth to that, mentorship was a real factor. Those who knew him best will tell you that Eamon often found his own way into rooms where he could make connections. He didn't wait for opportunities to fall into his lap. He positioned himself where opportunities naturally appeared. A key moment in these early dealings came when a shipment, small by later standards, was stolen from a crew he was working with. Instead of panicking or trying to find someone to blame, Eamon kept his head down, moved what product remained, and quietly worked to find out who was responsible. When he discovered it was an opportunistic low-level thief, he didn't seek a public confrontation. Instead, he engineered a situation where the thief had no choice but to return what he'd taken and apologize. The older members of the crew noticed this. They saw someone who could solve problems without making noise, and in their world, that was worth more than muscle. By his early 20s, Eamon was making more money than most men twice his age in legitimate work. He still lived modestly, at least in public, but he had begun to cultivate the network and influence that would one day make him the Don of Dublin's Northside. The first taste of crime had become something far more serious, and the boy who once stood on a corner as a lookout was now setting his sights on much bigger horizons. Learning the streets was never something Eamon Dunne sat down to study. It was something that seeped into him through every errand, every handshake, every tense moment in a smoky pub backroom. The streets of Dublin had their own language, one not spoken with words, but with glances, silences, and the shifting of weight in a man's stance. Eamon absorbed it all, not as a bystander, but as an active participant. watching for the tells that separated the survivors from the casualties. By the time he was in his early 20s, Eamon knew that knowing the geography of the city was only the beginning. Streets weren't just roads. They were living veins in a network, each one pulsing with its own rhythm of business, loyalty, and danger. In the Northside, there were certain alleyways where you didn't walk unless you had a reason. Certain pubs where a nod from the man behind the bar meant you could sit without trouble, and certain corners where every face was a stranger until proven otherwise. The older men in his orbit taught him that you didn't just memorize where places were, you memorized what they meant. A chipper in Fairview might seem like a regular takeaway to outsiders, but to those in the know, it was where certain crew leaders held short meetings when they didn't want to be seen in their usual haunts. A mechanic's garage in Drumcondra was more than a place for car repairs. It was where hot vehicles were cooled down with new plates and paperwork before being moved along to unsuspecting buyers. Eamon's role in these early years was often to bridge gaps between people who didn't or couldn't meet directly. A man on one side of the city needed a package delivered, but the man holding it didn't want to step foot in his rival's territory. Eamon, who seemed to get along with everyone and didn't yet have the kind of notoriety that made the Gardaí tail his every move, was the perfect go-between. Each time he made such a delivery, he learned more about the undercurrents of tension that ran beneath Dublin's gangland. He was also picking up lessons from the city's cultural split. Dublin, for all its size, was small enough that reputations traveled fast. Word of a man's trustworthiness, or lack thereof, could cross from the north side to the south side in the time it took to pull a pint. Eamon learned early that the wrong word in the wrong ear could undo months of careful work. As a result, he became disciplined with his speech. Conversations with him were often economical. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was with deliberate precision. It was during this period that Eamon fell under the informal mentorship of two older figures, one a retired smuggler who still had a network of contacts in Spain, and the other a nightclub manager with deep ties to the city's cocaine trade. Neither of them took him on as a protege in the traditional sense. Rather, they allowed him into their orbits, letting him see how deals were brokered, how disputes were settled without bloodshed, and how you could measure a man's reliability by watching what he did when no one was watching him. The smuggler taught him about patience. He explained how a single shipment could take months to arrange, how the money had to be moved in ways that couldn't be traced, and how one weak link in a chain could sink the entire operation. The nightclub manager, on the other hand, taught him about reading people in real time. In a club, you could see everything: who was flush with cash, who was itching for trouble, who was looking to make a connection. Eamon began to use these observations like tools, adjusting his approach depending on the mood of a room. Many people still think that these lessons were just practical skills for a career in crime, but in reality, they were survival strategies. In Dublin's gangland, survival was not a given. It was something you had to earn daily. Every conversation could be an opportunity or a trap. Every handshake could signal loyalty or betrayal. The difference was in the details, and Eamon was a master at catching them. One story from this era has been retold enough times that it has become part of his legend. Late one evening, Eamon was sitting in a corner booth of a Northside pub when a man he didn't know well approached him with an offer. The man claimed to have access to a shipment of cocaine that had been misplaced from a rival crew. The price was good, too good, in fact. Eamon listened politely, then told the man he'd think about it. Later, he learned that the misplaced shipment was bait, set up by the rival crew to see who would bite. Anyone who did would have been walking into a trap that might end in prison or worse. Eamon's refusal marked him as someone not easily fooled, and word of his caution spread. These were the years when Eamon began building the relationships that would define his later empire. His network wasn't made of loud, flashy associates, but of solid, dependable men who valued discretion as much as he did. He never seemed to have a large entourage, but those who stood beside him were fiercely loyal. He returned that loyalty in kind, ensuring that those who worked with him were paid fairly and treated with respect. The streets also taught him about timing. Deals had to be made when the moment was right, and moving too quickly or too slowly could be costly. He watched as other young operators made the mistake of trying to expand too fast, taking on more than they could handle, or getting caught in high-profile feuds that attracted too much attention from the Gardaí. Eamon stayed under the radar, content to let others burn themselves out, while he steadily built his foundation. He also learned about the value of quiet intimidation. He wasn't the kind of man to raise his voice or make threats he couldn't back up. Instead, he cultivated a calm presence that made people take him seriously, without the need for dramatics. Those who crossed him rarely had to be told twice that it was a mistake. By the mid-2000s, the young man who once ran simple errands had become a recognized presence in the city's underworld. He knew which streets to avoid on certain nights, which pubs would be trouble after closing time, and which people could be relied on when things got tense. He wasn't yet the Don of Dublin's Northside, but the streets had accepted him as one of their own, a player who understood the game and was playing it better than most. The drug trade was the current that pulled Eamon Dunne deeper into Dublin's underworld. By the early 2000s, it was no longer a backroom affair handled only by a handful of secretive old-timers. It had become the beating heart of gangland business. If you wanted to rise, you had to have your hands, directly or indirectly, on the supply lines. And if you wanted to stay on top, you had to protect them as if they were made of gold. Eamon had watched the trade evolve from the outside during his teenage years. In the late 90s, heroin had cast a long, deadly shadow over Dublin, devastating entire neighborhoods. The market for it was steady, but it was a market that burned through people quickly, both users and dealers. Cocaine, meanwhile, had a different clientele. It was becoming the drug of choice not only in working-class pubs, but also in nightclubs, private parties, and boardrooms. It promised energy, confidence, and glamour, and it didn't carry the same immediate stigma in the eyes of the middle class. This shift suited Eamon's ambitions perfectly. Heroin required a tight, paranoid network, and brought with it the constant threat of desperate addicts willing to rob or inform. Cocaine offered a cleaner, faster-moving trade with customers who could pay on time and in large amounts. It wasn't without its dangers. Nothing in this world was. But it allowed for a kind of business expansion that heroin didn't. His first real step into the cocaine market came through a connection in a Northside gym. The man wasn't a gangster in the traditional sense. He was a part-time personal trainer with a knack for sourcing extras for his higher-paying clients. The trainer knew a nightclub manager who wanted a more reliable supplier than the chaotic, overpriced dealers he'd been using. Eamon filled that role quietly at first, moving small but steady amounts and making sure that every transaction was smooth. Word began to spread, not through flashy boasting, but through the quiet language of satisfied customers. If you wanted product that was clean, measured properly, and delivered without drama, you went to Eamon. In a market where inconsistency and betrayal were common, that kind of reliability was worth more than the product itself. Many people still think that he jumped from street-level dealing straight into large-scale importing. But the truth is more gradual. He didn't rush into the deep end without knowing how to swim. Instead, he worked his way along the supply chain, learning each link as he went. He got to know the men who handled shipments at the docks, the drivers who could move goods across the city without being stopped, and the cleaners who laundered money through businesses that looked legitimate from the outside. One of his early breakthroughs came when he was introduced to a middleman operating out of the Netherlands. This man wasn't an Irish contact. He was a Moroccan-Dutch operator who had connections to South American suppliers. Meeting him required both trust and subtlety. Eamon traveled under the radar using cash, keeping his movements unremarkable. He returned to Dublin with not only a small trial shipment, but also the beginnings of an international network. That network was the real prize. The older Dublin bosses had often relied on a few established Spanish contacts for their continental supply. Eamon's generation, however, was willing to diversify. The Netherlands, Belgium, and even direct Caribbean connections were becoming more accessible thanks to the EU's open borders and modern shipping infrastructure. Eamon positioned himself in that new reality, becoming a man who could bypass the bottlenecks that slowed down other crews. In Dublin, this expansion did not go unnoticed. Rival crews began to see him not as a harmless young dealer, but as a threat to their share of the market. Some tried to poach his customers. Others considered more direct action. Eamon handled these challenges the way he handled everything else, measured, precise, and without unnecessary escalation. If a rival's approach could be countered by lowering prices or improving service, he did it. If a show of strength was needed, it was delivered in a way that left no doubt, but also no public spectacle. A moment from this period sticks in the memory of those who were close to him. A small-time dealer who owed Eamon money tried to stall payment, claiming his own customers had failed to pay up. In most cases, this would have led to a beating or worse. Instead, Eamon told him he had 1 week to settle the debt, and then offered to front him product at a discounted rate so he could make the money. The dealer took the offer, paid back what he owed, and ended up becoming one of Eamon's most loyal sellers. That mix of discipline and opportunity was a hallmark of his business style. The drug trade also forced Eamon to sharpen his operational security. The Gardaí were well aware of the market boom and were stepping up surveillance. Phones were tapped, cars were followed, and bank deposits were monitored. Eamon adapted by limiting what he discussed over the phone, changing vehicles frequently, and keeping his financial footprint light. Money was moved through cash-heavy businesses, bars, car washes, small import-export companies that gave the illusion of legitimate income. Through all this, he never forgot that his power came not from the drugs themselves, but from the network that moved them. The product was replaceable. The people who could be trusted to move it safely were not. He nurtured that network like a gardener, cutting away the weak branches but ensuring the strong ones flourished. By the mid-2000s, Eamon had built a reputation that reached beyond Dublin's Northside. He wasn't yet the uncontested Dunne, but his name carried weight in conversations between major players. His access to multiple supply lines meant he could weather disruptions that crippled other crews. If a Spanish shipment was intercepted, he had options in the Netherlands. If one port came under heavy Garda surveillance, he could switch to another. This flexibility was rare, and it made him valuable, not just to his own crew, but to others who might need a lifeline when their own supply dried up. The rise of Eamon Dunne in the drug trade was not a matter of loud declarations or violent takeovers. It was a matter of steady, deliberate expansion. He didn't try to be everywhere at once. He focused on being in the right places, with the right people, at the right times. And in the world he was building, that was far more dangerous than being the loudest man in the room. Building trust in Dublin's underworld was as delicate as balancing a pint on the edge of a wobbly bar table. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. For Eamon Dunne, it was the one currency more valuable than money, more vital than territory, and harder to acquire than any drug shipment. In a world where betrayal was almost a professional hazard, he understood that trust wasn't built with words alone. It was constructed through consistent actions, quiet reliability, and the unspoken understanding that your word was iron. By the time he was edging into his mid-20s, Eamon's reputation had spread far beyond the small circles he once moved in. The reason wasn't just that he supplied product or that he could source from multiple countries. It was that once he gave his word, people stopped worrying. In gangland Dublin, that was no small feat. Too many operators made promises they couldn't keep, overextended themselves, or simply cut corners when the heat was on. Eamon avoided all three traps. His method for building trust wasn't flashy. He didn't hand out wads of cash in public or make grand gestures in the hope of impressing a crowd. Instead, he showed up on time, delivered what he promised, and didn't talk about business to people who weren't part of it. In a city where loose lips could get you raided or buried, that alone set him apart. There was a story from these years about a shipment that went sideways when a contact in Antwerp got spooked by a police presence near the port. The man wanted to pull out entirely, afraid that moving the load would bring attention to himself. Eamon didn't argue or push. Instead, he arranged for the shipment to be split into smaller consignments and moved through less watched channels. It took an extra 2 weeks, but the product arrived safely, and no one ended up in a cell. That decision earned him not just a payday, but the permanent respect of the Antwerp contact, who later opened doors to bigger opportunities. Many people still think that trust in this world comes from intimidation. That fear is the same thing as loyalty. Eamon disagreed. He'd seen too many crews collapse when fear was the only glue holding them together. Fear could be bought or broken. Real trust required a kind of mutual investment. His crew trusted him to make decisions that kept them alive and profitable, and in turn, he trusted them to follow through without needing to be micromanaged. This mutual trust extended beyond his own organization. Other crews, sometimes even rivals, were willing to deal with him because they knew he wouldn't pull the kind of double cross that left bodies in alleyways. That didn't mean he was soft. It meant he understood that today's rival could be tomorrow's partner, if circumstances shifted. The Dublin underworld was too small to burn every bridge you crossed. One of his subtle techniques for building trust was in how he handled payments. If a deal went well, and the other party met their obligations, he paid quickly, sometimes even earlier than agreed. If there was a delay on his end, he explained it, gave a realistic timeline, and then delivered. This kind of transparency was rare, and it built a reputation for fairness. In a market where people often spent more time chasing what they were owed than actually doing business, Eamon's reliability was refreshing. The nightclubs became an important arena for this trust building. While many gangland figures used clubs purely as distribution hubs, Eamon treated them as neutral ground where relationships could be nurtured. He'd have quiet conversations in VIP corners, share drinks with potential allies, and make introductions between people who could benefit from knowing each other. He understood that a man might not remember the details of a transaction, but he'd remember who made him feel respected and secure during it. This approach even extended to how he handled conflicts. There was an incident in which a younger member of his crew had a heated argument with a seller connected to another gang. Tempers flared, words were exchanged, and it could easily have escalated into a violent feud. Eamon called both men into a private meeting the next day. Instead of punishing his own man publicly or humiliating the seller, he reframed the conflict as a misunderstanding and offered a compromise that left both parties satisfied. The seller went back to his own crew, speaking well of Eamon's diplomacy, and the young crew member learned a valuable lesson about when to talk and when to keep quiet. Over time, this careful cultivation of trust created a web of connections that was both wide and resilient. If the Garda E clamped down on one part of his network, other parts could compensate. If a supplier in one country had issues, another would step in. It wasn't luck. It was the direct result of years spent making sure that people knew dealing with Eamon Dunne meant less drama and more stability. It's important to understand that in the gangland economy, trust wasn't built in grand gestures. It was earned in small, repeated acts over long stretches of time. Eamon's genius lay in never treating those acts as insignificant. Whether it was delivering on a promise, smoothing over a dispute, or simply keeping his mouth shut when it mattered, he was always adding to the bank of credibility that would one day make him the most powerful figure on Dublin's Northside. By the late 2000s, that bank was overflowing. The people around him didn't just work for him, they believed in him. And in a city where loyalty was often temporary, that belief was the rarest asset of all. The first major score in Eamon Dunne's career wasn't the kind of explosive, headline-making robbery that most outsiders imagine when they hear the phrase. It wasn't a van hijacking on the M50 or a midnight break-in at a cash depot. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated move in the drug trade. A single deal that marked the point where Eamon stopped being a promising up-and-comer and became someone other players in Dublin's underworld had to reckon with. In the early 2000s, cocaine was flowing into Ireland in larger volumes than ever before, but not all of it came through the same hands. Most of the market was still dominated by a handful of older crews who controlled connections in Spain, and to a lesser extent, the Netherlands. They worked through tried and tested channels, but those channels were slow and often overpriced. Eamon saw an opening for a faster, cleaner route, and true to form, he didn't jump in blindly. Through his growing network, he heard whispers about a contact in Antwerp who could arrange smaller, more frequent shipments by piggybacking on legitimate cargo. It was a higher risk approach in some ways. More movements meant more opportunities for detection. But it also meant that losing one shipment wouldn't cripple the operation. The contact was looking for a new Irish buyer, someone who could take on the product quickly and quietly. Eamon put himself forward. The deal was set for late summer. The product would arrive hidden in a consignment of imported furniture, each package vacuum sealed and tucked deep inside chair cushions. The Antwerp contact would handle the port paperwork. Eamon's job was to ensure the goods moved from dock to safe house without attracting attention. For that, he relied on a small team of trusted drivers and loaders, men who had proven themselves in smaller jobs and knew how to follow instructions without improvising. Many people still think that this first major score was easy money, but the truth is that every moment from the docks to the safe house carried tension thick enough to choke on. The drivers moved in staggered intervals, never more than 2 vans near the port, at the same time. The route back into Dublin was mapped out to avoid major Garda checkpoints, with contingency stops arranged in case anything looked suspicious. Eamon himself wasn't at the port. He never put himself directly at the scene unless absolutely necessary. But he monitored every stage through a chain of quick, discreet phone calls. The final van pulled into the safe house just after dusk. The kind of fading light where everything feels like it's happening in a shadow. The product was weighed, checked for purity, and portioned into smaller packages for distribution. The count was exact. Nothing had been skimmed. Nothing had gone missing. That first major load didn't make him rich overnight, but it did something far more important. It proved he could handle weight at a higher level without any part of the process falling apart. Within weeks, word of the smooth operation had reached both allies and rivals. A few of the older crews, still skeptical of younger operators, were forced to admit that Eamon had pulled off something solid. He didn't spend the profits recklessly. A chunk went back into securing more product, ensuring that the Antwerp connection knew this wasn't a one-off purchase. Another portion was distributed among the crew, with each man getting slightly more than he'd expected. That was Eamon's way of showing that loyalty was rewarded. The rest went into what he liked to call the quiet fund. Money set aside for emergencies, bribes, or opportunities that came without warning. This score also marked a turning point in how Eamon carried himself. Before, he had moved like someone who was careful not to draw too much attention. Afterward, he walked with the subtle confidence of a man who knew he could play in the same league as Dublin's established names. He didn't flaunt it. There were no tabloid photos of him stepping out of sports cars or flashing gold watches. But those who knew the game could see it in the way people deferred to him in meetings, in the way rival crews began to factor his presence into their own plans. The Antwerp route became a cornerstone of his growing empire. Smaller, more frequent shipments kept the Gardaí guessing and meant that any one seizure was just a setback, not a disaster. Over time, Eamon diversified even further, adding contacts in Rotterdam and leveraging the old smuggler acquaintance he'd met years earlier for occasional Spanish loads. This layered supply network gave him something rare in Dublin's drug scene: resilience. But with the score came new problems. Success was visible, even when you tried to hide it. Rivals began probing his operation, sending feelers through intermediaries to see if they could poach his suppliers or undercut his prices. A few even tried to lure away members of his crew with promises of bigger cuts. Eamon countered these moves not with violence, at least not at first, but with loyalty. He made sure his people knew that working for him meant stability, regular pay, and a level of respect they wouldn't get elsewhere. One night, in a pub backroom, a rival approached one of Eamon's drivers with an offer. The driver listened, nodded, and then left the table to make a phone call. 20 minutes later, Eamon walked in, sat down across from the rival, and smiled. "You're fishing in the wrong pond," he said. The rival didn't push further. That was the thing about Eamon. He didn't need to shout or make threats. The calm way he said something was often enough to end the conversation. Looking back, that first major score wasn't just about the money or even the product. It was about proving that Eamon could think, plan, and execute at a professional level. It was about showing the underworld that he could be trusted with something bigger than neighborhood deals. It was the first time people began to speak of him not as that young lad doing well, but as a man to watch. By the time the last packages from that shipment were sold, Eamon had already lined up the next one. The wheel was in motion, and from here on, it wouldn't stop turning. The crew that formed around Eamon Dunne in the wake of his first major score was not an accident of chance. It was the product of deliberate, calculated selection. In Dublin's gangland, plenty of young men wanted in on a rising operation, but Eamon knew that having too many eager hands around could be as dangerous as having too few. He wasn't looking for soldiers who could just follow orders blindly. He wanted people who could be trusted to think, adapt, and hold their nerve when things got tense. At the time, his reputation was beginning to stretch across the Northside. People were talking about the Antwerp route, about the young man who could move product without losing a gram, about the way he seemed to have access to money without splashing it in the ways that attracted Garda attention. This visibility meant he could pick and choose who came close to him. He wasn't interested in building a gang for show. He wanted a crew that could function like a small, disciplined unit in a much larger war. The first to join him were men he'd known for years, childhood friends who'd been with him through the small jobs and the lean times. These were people he could trust with cash, with information, and most importantly, with his life. They'd already proven themselves in small deliveries, quiet negotiations, and the kind of street work where a single mistake could turn fatal. Eamon kept them close, not only because they'd earned it, but because they understood the value of silence. From there, the circle widened. A driver who could move across the city without being stopped by the Gardaí more than once a year. A man with a quiet but deadly reputation for settling disputes when talking failed. A pair of brothers who ran a small pub that doubled as a neutral meeting ground for all manner of underworld discussions. Each edition brought a new skill set, and Eamon never recruited two people with the same primary strength. He didn't want redundancy, and he didn't want internal competition. Many people still think that building a crew is just about finding people willing to commit crimes. But in Eamon's world, that was the easy part. The hard part was finding men who could be trusted to carry out instructions without adding their own flair. Too many operations had been sunk because someone wanted to show off, to make a deal bigger than it needed to be, or to score extra cash on the side. Eamon stamped that out from the beginning. You worked his way, or you didn't work with him at all. The crew operated with a quiet professionalism that stood in sharp contrast to the loud, brash style of some of their contemporaries. Other gangs rolled into pubs with a dozen men, ordering the most expensive drinks, throwing money around to make a point. Eamon's crew rarely drew that kind of attention. They came in small numbers, had their meetings, and left without fanfare. They weren't trying to impress the public. They were there to make the right people take them seriously. Inside the crew, loyalty wasn't demanded. It was cultivated. Eamon made sure everyone felt they had a stake in the operation's success. Profits were split in a way that reflected contribution, but no one was left feeling shortchanged. If a man took a risk for the crew, he was rewarded. If a man's family had trouble, the crew stepped in. This sense of shared fate bound them together far more effectively than threats ever could. The brothers who owned the pub became particularly valuable. Their place was a hub of information, a spot where gossip flowed as freely as the Guinness. They could listen without seeming to, pick up hints about Garda movements, rival deals, and shifting alliances. Information of this kind was as good as cash, and Eamon treated it that way. The driver, known for his ability to weave through Dublin traffic like it was second nature, handled more than just transportation. He became the crew's logistics man, plotting routes, timing deliveries, and making sure no one used the same path twice in a week. He had a knack for spotting checkpoints before they were visible, and more than once his instincts saved the crew from a run-in that could have ended badly. Then there was the quiet enforcer, a man whose presence alone was enough to make most disputes evaporate. He wasn't flashy, and he didn't need to be. His reputation was built on the fact that he never raised his voice, never lost his temper, but always finished what he started. Eamon valued him for more than just muscle. He could be sent to a tense meeting and return with a deal sealed, no blood spilled. As the crew solidified, Eamon also began to formalize their roles. Not everyone was involved in every aspect of the business. Some specialized in street-level distribution, others in maintaining overseas contacts, and a few in keeping the gardaí at bay through a mix of caution and connections. This division of labor meant that if one part of the crew took a hit, the rest could keep moving without collapsing entirely. One evening in late autumn, the crew proved its worth in a way that cemented their bond. A rival group had attempted to intercept one of Eamon's mid-level dealers, hoping to pressure him into switching sides. Instead of reacting with immediate violence, Eamon had his driver reroute the dealer's usual supply run and set up a quiet meeting with the rival crew's leaders. He didn't go alone. 2 of his most trusted men accompanied him. The meeting ended without a single punch thrown, but with a clear understanding. Eamon's people were off limits. The dealer, relieved and more loyal than ever, doubled his efforts in the weeks that followed. It was these kinds of calculated moves, backed by a crew who could be counted on to execute them without hesitation, that set Eamon apart. In the gangland of Dublin, many men could be feared, but far fewer could be trusted. Eamon had found a way to be both, and that made his crew not just a collection of criminals, but a force. By the time the Antwerp route had been running for over a year, the crew functioned like a well-oiled machine. Every man knew his role, every man knew the stakes, and every man knew that sticking with Eamon meant more than just surviving. It meant winning. Expanding operations was never a reckless leap for Eamon Dunne. It was a series of deliberate, layered moves that, when viewed from the outside, seemed almost effortless. By the mid-2000s, he had secured his Antwerp connection, built a reliable crew, and established a reputation for stability in a market that often lurched from one crisis to another. But in Dublin's underworld, staying in one lane for too long was a slow death. To survive and to thrive, Eamon needed to stretch his reach beyond the familiar corners of the Northside. Expansion meant different things depending on who you asked. For some crews, it was about taking over rival turf by intimidation or force. For Eamon, it meant weaving a web so wide that no single thread could be cut without the rest holding strong. He wasn't interested in painting his name across every block. He wanted to operate in a way that made it almost impossible to shut him down completely. His first step was to branch distribution into the southside, a move that older Northside bosses often avoided. The cultural divide between the two halves of the city was real, and crossing it without the right introductions could start a war. Eamon didn't barge in with trucks and foot soldiers. Instead, he identified smaller, established players on the south side who had good customer bases but shaky supply chains. Rather than replacing them, he offered to become their invisible partner, providing them with consistent, high-quality product while letting them keep their autonomy. They made more money, and he gained a foothold without firing a shot. This quiet infiltration spread further than most realized at the time. By keeping his name out of the Southside scene and working through intermediaries, Eamon avoided the kind of territorial clashes that had taken down other expanding crews. His partners there weren't loyal to him because of fear. They were loyal because their businesses had never been more profitable. Beyond Dublin, he started looking at port towns and smaller cities that served as natural gateways for product movement. Cork, Limerick, and Galway each had their own underworld ecosystems, and each had players who were open to outside supply if it came with the right terms. Eamon used his Antwerp and Rotterdam lines to offer product at prices that local suppliers couldn't match without sacrificing quality. It wasn't about flooding these markets. It was about establishing just enough presence that if Dublin ever got too hot, he could shift operations without losing momentum. Many people still think that this kind of expansion is purely about logistics, routes, shipments, safe houses. But the truth is, expansion in the drug trade is as much about diplomacy as it is about transportation. In Limerick, for example, tensions between two rival groups had created instability. Eamon avoided taking sides, supplying both through separate intermediaries who never realized they were working for the same man. In Cork, he won over a skeptical local operator by delivering a first shipment on credit, a gesture that built trust faster than any amount of talking could. To manage this growing network, Eamon began to adjust the structure of his crew. The tight inner circle remained, but now there were layers beneath them, trusted lieutenants who oversaw operations in specific areas. Each lieutenant had autonomy to handle local issues, but was required to report back on finances, product movement, and potential threats. This decentralization meant that the Gardaí could hit one part of the network without bringing the whole thing down. The nightclub scene became another pillar of expansion. While Eamon had always kept a foot in this world, the mid-2000s saw him invest more heavily in relationships with club owners, promoters, and even a few musicians who could draw crowds. These venues were perfect for moving high-margin product to customers who wanted both the experience and the illusion of exclusivity. A small number of his crew became regulars in these circles, blending in as nightlife personalities while quietly managing transactions. Of course, expansion brought new challenges. The more territory he touched, the more variables he had to control. Shipments had to move across longer distances, more people were involved, and the risk of leaks increased. Eamon dealt with this by implementing what his crew came to call the chain rule. No one in the operation ever had the full picture except him and one or two trusted men. A driver might know where to pick up a shipment, but not its origin. A seller might know his customers, but not the supplier's name. This compartmentalization meant that if someone talked, whether to rivals or the Gardaí, the damage would be limited. The Antwerp connection, now running with clockwork regularity, allowed him to offer an advantage over competitors: consistency. In the underworld, there's nothing more valuable than knowing your supplier won't vanish when the market gets tight. Rivals who relied on a single foreign contact found themselves scrambling when shipments were delayed or intercepted. Eamon's network simply adjusted, pulling from a different port or moving smaller loads more frequently to stay ahead of disruptions. One of the more telling moments from this period came during a dry spell in the Dublin market, when a series of seizures at Dublin port cut into supply. Prices spiked, tempers flared, and smaller crews started stepping on product to stretch it, selling lower quality goods at inflated prices. Eamon resisted the temptation to cut corners. Instead, he released stockpile reserves at the same quality as before, knowing that this would cement his reputation as a man who didn't short his customers even when the market was against him. When the shortage ended, those customers stayed, often bringing new buyers with them. Expansion also meant keeping a low public profile. While some rivals used their newfound wealth to flaunt cars, jewelry, and holidays, Eamon kept his spending restrained in public view. His private life may have had its luxuries, but to the outside world, he looked like a man living comfortably, not extravagantly. This helped him avoid drawing unnecessary attention from the Criminal Assets Bureau, which was increasingly aggressive in targeting gangland figures flaunting unexplained wealth. By the late 2000s, Eamon's operations spanned multiple layers of Dublin and reached into other Irish cities, all without the kind of open warfare that often came with expansion. He hadn't just grown in size, he'd grown in resilience. Every move he made was calculated to strengthen the web, so that even if one thread snapped, the rest would hold. And yet, as strong as the operation was becoming, there was a quiet understanding in the crew. With each step into new territory, they were also stepping closer to a level of visibility that would make Eamon a bigger target than ever before. Dealing with competition was something every serious figure in Dublin's gangland had to face sooner or later. But for Eamon Dunne, it was never a matter of raw muscle or random acts of intimidation. By the time his operations had taken root across the Northside, filtered into the Southside, and touched other cities, he understood that rivals weren't just a nuisance. They were an unavoidable fact of the business, as permanent as the rain that soaked O'Connell Street in winter. The difference between surviving and being buried in this world often came down to how you managed that fact. For Eamon, competition was a chessboard. Each rival wasn't just a threat. They were a piece that could be moved, blocked, traded with, or in some cases, removed entirely. He had no interest in turning Dublin into a blood-soaked battleground for the sake of pride. Violence, he believed, was a last resort, not because he feared it, but because it attracted the kind of Garda attention that could unravel years of careful work. When new players tried to muscle in on Northside territory, Eamon didn't rush to meet them with an army. Instead, he sent quiet feelers through intermediaries. Sometimes a rival could be reasoned with, offered a piece of the trade in exchange for staying out of certain markets. Other times, he'd undercut them subtly, offering better prices to their key customers until their foothold began to slip. This was the kind of warfare that didn't make headlines, but left an impact that was hard to reverse. There's a story that goes back to a period when a young, flashy crew from the South Side began targeting Eamon's nightclub connections. They were aggressive, offering cut-rate deals, throwing cash around, making sure everyone knew they were ready to play hard. Eamon didn't respond immediately. He let them make their noise, let them burn through money, and quietly watched who took their bait. Then, one night, he sent a shipment to one of their biggest buyers, at a price lower than what they were offering, and with better quality. He didn't try to take every customer they had, just the ones that would hurt the most. Within 2 months, the flashy crew was dealing with unsold stock, unpaid debts, and whispers that they couldn't compete. They faded out without Eamon ever having to lift a finger in public. Many people still think this approach was a sign of him going soft, but the truth was the opposite. It was a way of making his dominance invisible to the Gardaí. A quiet market shift wouldn't bring the same level of police raids that a string of shootings would, but it could cripple a rival far more effectively. This didn't mean Eamon never had to show his teeth. Some rivals couldn't be bargained with or undercut. They thrived on chaos, on making a name through violence. For these, his crew had contingency plans. A rival safe house might find itself suddenly under Garda scrutiny because of an anonymous tip. A shipment might disappear before it even hit the city, only to reappear in the hands of one of Eamon's partners. These were precise, targeted strikes, carried out with the kind of control that left no trail pointing back to him. Competition also existed on the supply side. Other Dublin figures had their own European contacts, and they weren't eager to see a younger man taking up more space in the market. Eamon navigated this by building redundancy into his supply lines. If one contact tightened the terms or tried to exert pressure, he could simply shift focus to another, ensuring that no single supplier ever had full leverage over him. This flexibility made it difficult for rivals to squeeze him by leaning on his foreign connections. The Antwerp route had taught him that diversification wasn't just about geography. It was about relationships. He didn't just buy from his contacts, he invested in them. A supplier in Rotterdam once ran into trouble with a shipment seized by customs. Eamon advanced part of the loss back to him without being asked. The gesture wasn't charity, it was insurance. Months later, when that same supplier had access to a particularly pure batch, Eamon was the first to get the call, ahead of every other Irish buyer. At home, his competition was rarely just other drug crews. Dublin's underworld was layered. Loan sharks, armed robbers, smuggling rings, and their interests often overlapped. If a smuggling crew wanted to move product through a port where Eamon had influence, he'd make a deal. If a loan shark's client base included some of his street-level distributors, he'd ensure the debt collectors stayed friendly. In some cases, he even acted as a mediator between feuding crews, not because he wanted to play peacekeeper, but because every fight he could prevent was one less risk to his business. His crew played a vital role in this balancing act. The brothers who ran the pub were his ears on the ground, catching rumors before they turned into problems. The driver tracked movement in and out of key areas, noting if new faces were hanging around supply routes. The quiet enforcer's presence in certain venues was enough to remind people that, while Eamon preferred peace, he wasn't defenseless. One of the more remarkable aspects of Eamon's way of dealing with competition was his patience. In an industry where ego often dictated action, he was willing to let certain issues simmer until the timing was right. If a rival was overconfident, he'd let them stretch themselves thin before making his move. If someone was known for rash decisions, he'd wait for them to make a mistake and then position himself to benefit from it. There was a moment in 2007 when this patience paid off in a way that reshaped the Northside market. A mid-level operator, emboldened by a temporary spike in demand, tried to expand too quickly, pulling resources from his core business to chase new territory. Eamon said nothing at first. He even facilitated a small deal with the man, giving the impression of support. But when the inevitable cash flow problems hit, Eamon stepped in, not to crush him, but to take over his remaining distribution quietly, absorbing his best people into his own network. The man's name disappeared from the scene almost overnight. By the end of the decade, Eamon's grip on the Northside was firm, not because he'd wiped out every competitor, but because he'd neutralized them in ways that often left them owing him favors. Even those who disliked him could acknowledge that he was efficient, consistent, and most dangerously predictable in his unpredictability. And yet, the higher he climbed, the clearer it became that competition wouldn't just come from the streets. There were older forces in Dublin's underworld who viewed his rise as a challenge to the balance they had maintained for years. How he would handle those entrenched powers was a question that would soon define the next phase of his story. Family ties were never a simple matter for Eamon Dunne. In Dublin's underworld, the line between personal and professional life was as blurred as the horizon in a winter fog. Some men managed to keep their family completely separate from their criminal dealings, building a wall that never cracked. Others dragged their relatives directly into the business, willingly or not, turning dinner tables into boardrooms. Eamon existed somewhere in between, navigating that treacherous middle ground where loyalty to blood sometimes clashed with loyalty to the crew. From the outside, his family looked like many others on the Northside. Siblings who still met for the occasional meal, a mother who tried to keep track of everyone's lives, and cousins scattered through various neighborhoods. Those who knew better understood that the Dunne family carried its own set of unspoken rules. Family didn't betray family, no matter the cost. Disputes were handled internally, without letting outsiders in. And if someone in the family got into trouble, the rest closed ranks before anyone had to ask. Eamon's mother had lived long enough to see what the streets could do to young men. She never approved of his work, at least, not openly. But she also wasn't naive. She knew that in certain neighborhoods, telling your son to stay away from crime was like telling him to stay away from the rain. You could warn him all you wanted, but it would still find him. Her approach was to urge caution, to remind him of the family's name, and to make it clear that whatever he did, he should avoid shaming those closest to him. The brothers and cousins in his extended family had varying degrees of involvement in his operation. Some stayed clean, working legitimate jobs, content to keep their distance. Others found themselves pulled in gradually, first doing small favors, then running errands, and eventually managing low-level distribution. Eamon was careful with how much he exposed them to. He understood that bringing family too close to the heart of the business could create vulnerabilities. The Gardaí loved nothing more than to pressure a relative into talking, and rival crews could use family members as leverage. Still, there were times when blood ties became an asset. A cousin who worked in shipping could quietly pass along information about container inspections at Dublin port. A brother-in-law in construction might offer access to vacant properties perfect for short-term storage. These weren't constant channels, but they were there when needed, and Eamon knew better than to overlook them. Many people still think that his reliance on family was a weakness, that it created blind spots in an otherwise meticulous operation. But those who worked with him saw that it was handled with the same caution as every other aspect of his empire. Family members who were involved knew the same rules as the crew. No unnecessary talk, no freelancing, no deviation from instructions. Eamon didn't give them special treatment when it came to discipline. If anything, he was harder on them, making it clear that carrying the Dunne name meant representing it properly. Balancing home life with the demands of a growing criminal network was a constant challenge. There were family events where he had to switch masks instantly. One moment discussing a nephew's football match, the next taking a phone call about a delayed shipment. He had a talent for compartmentalizing, keeping the tone light around relatives even when his mind was running through contingency plans for a deal gone sideways. There's a story from one Christmas dinner that his crew still tells with a mix of amusement and respect. In the middle of the meal, Eamon received a quiet text. A shipment that had been due the next day was arriving early, and the drop-off point had changed last minute. Most men would have made an excuse to leave immediately. Eamon stayed until dessert, laughing with family, keeping his composure. When he finally stepped out, he made 2 short calls, and by the time he arrived at the meeting point hours later, everything was already in motion. The shipment was secured without him having to be physically present. It was a reminder that he didn't just run his operation, he built it to run without him when necessary. Family ties also served as a kind of shield in the public eye. Eamon was seen at birthdays, weddings, and neighborhood gatherings, blending into the backdrop of normal life. These appearances helped maintain the image of a man who was simply part of his community, not the orchestrator of a sprawling network. Even some Garda officers admitted that it was hard to reconcile the quiet man at a christening with the figure whispered about in surveillance briefings. But the same ties that offered cover could also create tension. Not every relative approved of his choices, and a few worried openly about the risks he was taking. There were tense conversations in kitchens and hallways, warnings about the inevitable fall that awaited men in his position. Eamon listened, nodded, and went on as before. He understood their fears, but he also believed in the path he was on, one where control, caution, and calculated growth could keep him ahead of the disasters that had consumed others. The balance between blood loyalty and operational security was never static. It shifted with circumstances, tightening when threats arose, loosening when the market was calm. By the late 2000s, Eamon had managed to maintain both worlds without letting them collapse into each other. It was a delicate act, and one that couldn't last forever. But for the moment, it worked. In gangland Dublin, there were men who ruled with fear, men who ruled with wealth, and men who ruled with influence. Eamon Dunne's unique position came from ruling with a combination of all three, anchored by the unshakable, complicated loyalty of family. And as the city's underworld continued to evolve, those family ties would become both an asset and a test of everything he had built. The Celtic Tiger era was in full roar by the mid to late 2000s, and Dublin felt like it had been lifted into an entirely different orbit. For the city's legitimate business class, it meant glass office towers sprouting where derelict warehouses once stood, new hotels glowing with marble lobbies, and the sense that money was endless. For the underworld, it was a gold rush hidden in plain sight. The more the city's legal economy expanded, the more cracks appeared for illegal money to seep through, and Eamon Dunne knew exactly how to navigate them. He had grown up in a Dublin that was still scarred by the heroin crisis and gangland wars of the 1990s, when every day seemed to bring another grim headline. Now, the streets were buzzing with construction crews, boutiques, and champagne-soaked nightclubs. The contrast was staggering. In the Celtic Tiger years, illicit fortunes could be made not just from the product itself, but from how quickly you could move that money into seemingly legitimate channels. For Eamon, this was the perfect climate. He wasn't just a dealer anymore. He was becoming a quiet investor, a man who understood that a growing economy gave cover for the sudden appearance of wealth. People were buying bigger houses, fancier cars, and more expensive clothes. If someone from the Northside rolled up in a brand new German car, it didn't raise eyebrows the way it would have a decade earlier. The city had become too busy counting its own money to ask where anyone else's came from. This economic shift also meant a massive increase in demand for cocaine. In the older days, cocaine had been something whispered about in exclusive circles, often imported in tiny quantities for private parties. Now, it was flowing freely through the city's nightlife. Middle-class professionals were snorting lines in club bathrooms. Footballers and pop singers were spotted partying into the early hours with little attempt to hide it. Demand was growing faster than some crews could supply it, and those who could maintain a steady pipeline were poised to dominate. Eamon, with his Antwerp and Rotterdam connections, was perfectly positioned. His network could feed both the working-class markets of the Northside and the champagne bars of the Southside. The crew adapted to the era's appetite for flash, but always within boundaries. Some of his younger lieutenants started dressing sharper, wearing watches that hinted at success without screaming for Garda attention. The product was packaged cleaner, sometimes even branded for certain clients. Small touches that made it seem less like a street corner purchase and more like part of a luxury lifestyle. Many people still think the Celtic Tiger years made gangland figures reckless, and in some cases, they're right. A lot of operators mistook the economic boom for invincibility, burning through profits on sports cars, gambling trips, and entourages. Eamon's approach was different. Yes, he let his crew enjoy the fruits of their work, but he also kept them grounded. He reminded them, often, that boom times never lasted forever, and that the smarter move was to build something that could survive the crash when it came. He also began to explore more sophisticated laundering methods. Car dealerships became a favored route, not to sell cars, but to use them as financial instruments. Vehicles could be bought in cash, transferred through multiple owners, and resold, with the money appearing to have a legitimate source. Certain nightclubs were also useful, especially those where cash transactions made it easy to blend illicit funds with legitimate takings. Eamon never owned these businesses outright. Instead, he held quiet stakes through trusted third parties, ensuring his name never appeared on paper. The Celtic Tiger climate also brought a new kind of competition, not just from rival crews, but from legitimate entrepreneurs willing to skirt the edges of legality to make fast money. Some nightclub owners were more than happy to turn a blind eye to what was happening in their bathrooms, as long as the right envelopes were passed under the table. A few even acted as middlemen, introducing high-paying clients to their preferred suppliers. Eamon navigated this by becoming the preferred supplier for several venues, offering reliability and discretion that others couldn't match. His presence in these spaces was carefully calibrated. He wasn't the kind of boss who stood on a nightclub balcony surrounded by security, announcing himself. Instead, he'd be seen occasionally, usually in a tailored suit, greeting owners and key staff, then slipping away before the night got too loud. For the people who needed to know him, he was accessible. For everyone else, he was just another well-dressed man passing through. One of the more telling episodes from this period involved a Southside club that had been struggling with supply interruptions. Their regular dealer had been caught in a Garda sting, and the owner, desperate to keep his clientele happy, was put in touch with Eamon through a mutual contact. The first delivery arrived on time, at the agreed quality, and the club's business rebounded almost immediately. From that point on, Eamon didn't just supply the club. He supplied the perception that it was untouchable, that no matter what happened in the rest of the city, this venue's patrons would never go without. At the same time, the Celtic Tiger years were reshaping the way Garda units approached organized crime. There was more money for surveillance, more cooperation with European agencies, and a greater focus on financial tracking. The Criminal Assets Bureau, in particular, became a growing concern. They weren't just seizing drugs and cash. They were freezing bank accounts, confiscating cars, and even taking houses linked to suspected gangland figures. Eamon's strategy of keeping his assets in other people's names paid off here. While other bosses were watching their possessions get loaded onto tow trucks, his life appeared largely unchanged. In this booming economy, even the perception of stability was valuable. Eamon's crew rarely missed payments to suppliers or distributors, and disputes were resolved quickly. This reputation meant that even during occasional droughts in the market, he could borrow product or cash on credit from contacts who trusted he'd make good. But the boom years weren't just about profit. They were about laying the groundwork for the inevitable downturn. Eamon quietly invested in properties outside Dublin, some in smaller towns where no one asked too many questions. These weren't flashy purchases. They were safe houses, fallback points, and assets that could be liquidated in leaner times. By the tail end of the Celtic Tiger era, Eamon Dunne had transformed his operation into something that didn't just feed off the city's economic wave. It had learned how to ride it without wiping out when the tide turned. The Dublin underworld had more players than ever, but few had adapted as well as he had. And when the crash finally came, as it always does, he'd be ready in ways his rivals couldn't imagine. Police pressure was never a distant, abstract concept for Eamon Dunne. It was a daily presence, a shadow that followed every shipment, every meeting, and every deal. By the time the Celtic Tiger was at its height, the Gardaí had long since learned that tackling Dublin's gangland required more than chasing individual dealers or seizing the occasional load. They had evolved, and with that evolution came an intensity of focus that few in Eamon's world could ignore. He understood early that Garda attention wasn't just about the product, it was about patterns. The men and women in organized crime units weren't amateurs. They had the time, funding, and mandate to piece together connections slowly, waiting for the moment to strike. This meant that every choice he made had to factor in not just the immediate outcome, but the paper trail, the phone records, and the surveillance footage that might exist weeks or months later. In the early years of his expansion, Garda interest in Eamon was minimal. He was a name mentioned here and there in reports, a person of interest, but not a high-priority target. That began to change after the Antwerp connection solidified, and his network started to outpace older crews. Informants within the underworld were passing along his name more often, sometimes in connection with seizures that couldn't quite be pinned on him. The Gardaí began to take note, and the shift in their attention was subtle but unmistakable. One of the first signs came when a safe house he used in Drumcondra was quietly placed under surveillance. Eamon caught wind of it not through any direct warning, but through the sharp instincts of his driver, who noticed the same unmarked car parked on the street 2 days in a row, facing opposite directions each time. It wasn't proof, but it was enough for Eamon to shut the location down within hours. By that evening, everything that mattered had been moved, leaving nothing behind but empty crates and the smell of stale beer. He learned to treat Garda surveillance like bad weather. You couldn't stop it from coming, but you could work around it. This meant varying meeting spots, never using the same vehicle for too long, and changing phones so frequently that some weeks he cycled through 3 different numbers. The phones were bought in cash, registered to no one, and destroyed after short periods of use. Many people still think that avoiding police attention is simply a matter of staying out of sight. But Eamon knew it was also about controlling the image they built of you. He let them see him in certain settings: legitimate public events, family gatherings, occasional appearances in respectable venues, so that when reports were filed, there was always ambiguity. Was he the criminal mastermind some claimed, or just another well-connected man with friends in questionable circles? This strategy frustrated the Gardaí. They could connect him to known figures, they could place him in locations of interest, but hard evidence remained elusive. Every time they moved closer to building a case, the trail went cold. Shipments were intercepted, yes, but never in a way that led directly to him. Associates who were arrested rarely had enough information to do more than name him as a person they'd seen around, which wasn't enough for a charge. Still, the pressure built. The Gardaí were becoming more aggressive in targeting not just individuals, but entire networks. They had started to use financial investigations as a weapon, freezing accounts and seizing assets that were even loosely connected to suspected criminal activity. Eamon's earlier caution in keeping assets in other names became critical here. When the Criminal Assets Bureau began hitting other crews with property seizures, his own public portfolio looked modest. No sudden influx of visible wealth, no properties purchased directly in his name. There were moments when the pressure became more tangible. In one instance, Gardaí set up a highly visible checkpoint on a route they knew one of Eamon's mid-level distributors used regularly. The checkpoint wasn't about catching anything that day, it was about sending a message. Eamon responded by rerouting his movements completely, even if it meant longer, less efficient delivery runs. His philosophy was simple. Inconvenience was better than exposure. Informants were another ever-present threat. In Dublin's underworld, no matter how careful you were, there was always the risk that someone, somewhere, would trade information for a lighter sentence. Eamon countered this not by relying solely on loyalty, but by structuring his operation so that very few people knew enough to cause real damage. A street-level seller might know the face of the man delivering his packages, but not his real name, and certainly not where the product came from. Even within the crew, information was compartmentalized. No one outside the inner circle could draw the full map. There's a well-circulated story from this period about a Garda operation that nearly closed in on him. Intelligence suggested that a large shipment was set to arrive via a warehouse in the port tunnel area. The Gardaí planned to catch it mid-transfer with surveillance in place days in advance. But the morning of the expected delivery, the shipment simply didn't arrive. Hours later, it turned up in a different location entirely, already broken down and dispersed. How Eamon got word of the operation remains a matter of speculation. Some say it was a tip from a dock worker he'd helped years earlier. Others think it was just his uncanny sense for danger. Either way, it was a clean escape, and the Gardaí were left with nothing but paperwork and frustration. The increased police presence also shaped how Eamon handled internal discipline. Any breach that risked drawing Garda attention was dealt with immediately, whether it came from carelessness or arrogance. In one case, a young associate started flashing cash in ways that drew unwanted eyes. Eamon pulled him aside, explained the stakes in terms that made it clear there would be no second warning, and moved him to a lower visibility role. The associate either learned the lesson or got the message. He kept his head down from then on. By the late 2000s, it was clear that Eamon wasn't just another name in Garda reports. He was a priority target. Task forces had his photo on their walls. Intelligence meetings included discussions about how to breach his operational security, and undercover officers were assigned to infiltrate areas where his crew was known to operate. He countered by tightening his already strict rules, reducing the number of face-to-face meetings, and increasing the use of dead-drop exchanges that left no direct contact between supplier and receiver. This constant cat-and-mouse game with law enforcement wasn't just a side effect of his position. It was part of the reality he had built his entire operation to withstand. Where others saw police pressure as an unpredictable hazard, Eamon treated it as a predictable constant. And as long as he could keep predicting their moves, he could keep his empire intact. Still, the higher the pressure climbed, the more everyone in his orbit knew that one mistake, a single wrong conversation, a moment of misplaced trust, could turn the Gardaí from a shadow at his back into a hand on his shoulder. The nightclub scene in Dublin during the late Celtic Tiger years was an ecosystem of its own, a place where music, money, and illicit opportunity blended under dim lights and pounding bass. For Eamon Dunne, it was more than just a place to unwind. It was a marketplace, a networking venue, and a perfect camouflage for deals that needed to happen in plain sight. In a nightclub, everyone looked like they were just there to enjoy themselves. Behind the velvet ropes, though, real business was being done. Eamon had been orbiting this world for years, but by the time his name began circulating in the upper tiers of Dublin's underworld, he was a fixture in certain venues without ever being overexposed. He understood the delicate balance. Be seen enough to maintain presence and authority, but never so much that the gardaí could build patterns out of your movements. The clubs themselves were an ideal front for certain operations. Cash was everywhere. Cover charges, bar tabs, table service, and it moved fast. Money could be washed in a single night, simply by blending illicit earnings with the flood of legitimate takings. For a man like Eamon, who prized discretion, the environment was perfect. He didn't need to own these venues outright. Instead, he cultivated relationships with their owners, managers, and even some of the head bartenders, ensuring he always had a back door into the flow of business. One of his early strongholds in this scene was a sleek southside nightclub known for drawing athletes, musicians, and the kind of wealthy young professionals who thought they were untouchable. Eamon didn't run product through the front door. Instead, he had a trusted intermediary who handled distribution quietly in VIP areas, keeping it away from the main floor. This way, there was no obvious link between the club's staff and the activity, and the few customers who got access felt like they were part of an exclusive inner circle. Many people still think the nightclub connection was just about selling cocaine to partygoers, but for Eamon, it was just as much about intelligence gathering. Clubs were where loose talk happened. People bragged after a few drinks. Deals were discussed at tables in the corner, and rival figures showed up with entourages that revealed their new alliances. Eamon didn't always need to be present to benefit. He often had someone there whose job was simply to watch, listen, and report back. One such night, a trusted associate spotted a rival in conversation with a man known to have access to a Rotterdam supply line. The rival's crew had been struggling with quality for weeks, so the meeting made sense. But it also told Eamon that a competitor was about to get stronger. Within days, he adjusted his own prices in key areas, ensuring that by the time the rival's new product hit the streets, it would have to compete against a cheaper, equally pure alternative. The rival's boost in supply fizzled before it could build momentum. Nightclubs also served as neutral ground for sensitive conversations. If you met in an office or a private home, the setting itself could raise suspicion or make people guarded. In a nightclub, you could lean in close, speak quietly, and blend into the noise. Eamon preferred private booths for serious discussions, places where the sound system's bass made it nearly impossible for anyone to eavesdrop. The topics covered ranged from new supply arrangements to resolving territorial misunderstandings before they turned into violence. His crew operated in these venues with the same discipline they applied elsewhere. There were no drunken scenes, no public arguments, and certainly no fights on the dance floor. Anyone in his orbit who couldn't maintain composure in that environment was quietly phased out. The idea was simple. In the nightclub world, reputation was fragile. One bad night could sour relationships with owners and close doors that had taken years to open. The financial benefits of the nightclub scene were substantial, but the social benefits were just as valuable. Being connected to high-profile venues allowed Eamon to mingle with people outside the usual underworld circles. Entertainers, minor celebrities, even a few local politicians who enjoyed the nightlife. These encounters didn't always lead directly to business, but they helped him craft an image of a man who moved in many worlds. The gardaí might have their suspicions, but the public saw a figure who could plausibly be described as a businessman with interests in hospitality. It wasn't without risk. The gardaí knew nightclubs were fertile ground for the drug trade, and they targeted them regularly with raids and undercover operations. Eamon kept his direct involvement invisible. He was never the man handing over product or even present on the nights when heavy business was done. If a raid happened, his name might be whispered, but it was never attached to a specific act the gardaí could prove. There's a well-known night when one of his southside venues was hit by a surprise Garda sweep. Doors were locked, patrons searched, and a few small quantities of cocaine were found. The club's management claimed ignorance, and none of the staff were caught with anything. Eamon's intermediary had already left hours earlier with the night's profits, tipped off by subtle changes in the bouncer's behavior, changes that only someone trained to notice could have spotted. The incident barely made the papers, and business resumed within a week. The nightclub network also acted as a kind of soft power in disputes. If a rival stepped out of line, Eamon could quietly ensure they found themselves unwelcome at certain venues, cutting them off from high-value customers and social circles that kept them relevant. It wasn't as flashy as sending a crew to smash windows, but it hurt in ways that were harder to recover from. By the late 2000s, Eamon's presence in Dublin's nightlife was both subtle and undeniable. He wasn't a club kingpin in the obvious sense. No ownership plaques, no photo spreads in society magazines. But he had influence in enough venues that his reach extended deep into the city's after-dark economy. Deals were made under his watch. Reputations were shaped or destroyed in spaces he controlled, and the steady flow of cash kept feeding the larger machine of his operations. For Eamon, the nightclub scene wasn't just a side hustle. It was a pillar of his strategy, one that provided money, intelligence, influence, and a layer of protection that few other aspects of the trade could offer. And in the delicate balance of Dublin's underworld, those four things together were worth far more than the profit from any single night's takings. Crossing paths with old enemies was inevitable for someone like Eamon Dunne. The underworld in Dublin was big enough to offer opportunities, but small enough that grudges had a way of circling back. Every street, every pub, every whispered meeting carried the chance of running into someone who remembered a debt, a betrayal, or a perceived slight from years earlier. In Eamon's case, some of those grudges had roots that stretched back to the days when he was still running small errands for other men, learning the trade from the bottom up. By the late 2000s, Eamon's position meant that any encounter with an old rival could have serious consequences. The people he'd outmaneuvered in the past weren't all gone. Some had faded into obscurity, but others had clawed their way back into relevance, and they hadn't forgotten. What made these situations even more dangerous was that the stakes had grown. These weren't disputes over a few €100 or a single package. They were about territory, supply lines, and influence in a market where one misstep could cost millions. One of the most significant ghosts from his past came in the form of a former Northside associate named Decky Walsh. Years earlier, Decky and Eamon had moved in overlapping circles, both working low-level jobs under a mid-tier boss who controlled part of the heroin trade. Eamon had quietly stepped away from that world when he saw the long-term damage heroin was doing to the neighborhoods, and the heat it was drawing from the gardaí. Decky stayed, and for a while he thrived, until his crew was dismantled in a series of arrests. When Decky resurfaced, he was running with a new crowd, dabbling in cocaine distribution, but without the quality or consistency to seriously challenge Eamon's network. Still, pride can be a dangerous motivator. Decky started trying to poach Eamon's smaller clients, offering them cheaper product sourced from less reliable channels. At first, Eamon ignored it, but when one of his long-standing customers switched to Decky's supply and ended up with a product so poor it caused a public scene in a nightclub bathroom, Eamon stepped in. Rather than confront Decky directly, Eamon arranged a quiet meeting through a mutual contact, framing it as a chance to clear the air. The conversation was calm, almost friendly, but the message was clear. You've got your lanes, I've got mine. Keep to yours, and we'll never have a problem. Decky nodded, agreed, and then, a month later, tried again. That time, Eamon didn't bother with a conversation. Within weeks, Decky's next shipment was intercepted at the port. Rumor had it that a tip-off had guided customs officers directly to it. Whether or not the story was true, Decky got the message. Many people still think that Eamon thrived on open confrontation, but the truth is, he preferred these kinds of surgical interventions. They carried less risk, created fewer headlines, and left him looking like a man who didn't even need to lift a finger to make problems disappear. Not all old enemies were as easy to neutralize. Another figure from the past, a southside operator named Martin Marto Kearns, had a longer memory and a more personal grudge. Years earlier, Marto had been outmaneuvered in a deal for nightclub distribution rights, a deal Eamon had secured through a combination of timing, better pricing, and relationships with the venue's management. Marto had never forgiven the loss, seeing it as a public humiliation. When Marto returned to the scene with fresh backing from a Spanish supplier, it was clear he intended to take another run at Eamon's position in the market. This time, the challenge was direct. He began moving product into venues Eamon had influence over, trying to undercut him not just on price, but on visibility. It was a dangerous game. If Eamon allowed it to continue, it could signal weakness to others. Rather than react impulsively, Eamon turned to the intelligence network he'd built through his crew and nightclub contacts. He wanted to know every move Marto was making, every shipment, every meeting. Over the course of a few months, patterns began to emerge. Marto's operation depended heavily on a single shipment route through Lisbon, using a particular freight company that had lax inspection protocols. Once Eamon confirmed the pattern, it was only a matter of time before that route was compromised. When the inevitable seizure happened, Marto's backers in Spain weren't forgiving. Without product and under pressure from creditors, Marto's expansion attempt collapsed. Eamon hadn't fired a shot or made a public threat, but in the space of a single quarter, a dangerous rival had been taken off the board. Old enemies also appeared in more subtle forms, sometimes not in the person themselves, but in their family or protégés. A young distributor in the Midlands turned out to be the nephew of a man Eamon had edged out of a territory years earlier. The nephew came in with a chip on his shoulder, pushing aggressively for deals that didn't make sense and refusing to work through proper channels. Eamon recognized the pattern immediately. Instead of shutting him out entirely, he gave the young man a small, tightly controlled piece of business, enough to keep him occupied, but never enough to pose a real threat. Eventually, the young distributor burned himself out through his own inexperience, and the grudge died with his operation. These encounters taught Eamon a valuable truth. Time doesn't erase grudges in the underworld. It just changes the way they're expressed. A man who seemed beaten might return years later with new allies, while a minor slight from a decade ago could resurface in the form of a sudden betrayal. That was why Eamon never let his guard down, no matter how stable things appeared. His approach to old enemies mirrored his approach to business as a whole. Stay calm, stay informed, and strike only when the conditions were right. By controlling the terms of engagement, he kept situations from spiraling into the kind of all-out feuds that drained resources and drew Garda attention. And yet, for all his caution, there was an unspoken truth in his world. Sometimes, old enemies couldn't be contained forever. The Dublin underworld was a closed loop, and every name, every face, eventually came back around. Whether the next encounter would be settled with a handshake or a headline was something Eamon could never fully predict, but he was always ready to make sure it ended on his terms. International connections were the lifeblood of Eamon Dunne's empire by the late 2000s. Dublin might have been his base, but the true scale of his business and the true measure of his power depended on relationships that stretched far beyond Ireland's shores. The city's drug market was no longer fed by small-scale smuggling through ferries or opportunistic mules on holiday flights. It had evolved into a highly organized supply chain, and Eamon had positioned himself not as a customer at the end of that chain, but as a partner within it. The Antwerp and Rotterdam routes had given him more than just product. They had introduced him to a network of men who operated on a scale most Irish crews could only imagine. These were not street dealers or flashy nightclub figures. They were logistics specialists, freight company owners, corrupt port officials, and intermediaries with direct lines to South American producers. They spoke in quantities that would flood entire neighborhoods for months and moved money in amounts that never touched a bank ledger. One of Eamon's most important breakthroughs came through a contact named Javier, a Colombian middleman based in Spain. Javier wasn't at the top of the cartel ladder, but he was close enough to have access to consistent shipments and far enough down to be flexible with his arrangements. Many people still think that Colombian connections automatically meant danger, and they weren't wrong. But Javier understood that stability was more profitable than chaos. Eamon saw in him the same values he prized: reliability, discretion, and a willingness to keep the business free of unnecessary drama. The first deal between them was small by cartel standards, but huge for Eamon. A partial container of coffee beans shipped from Cartagena to Valencia, with the real cargo sealed in vacuum-packed bricks inside the sacks. From Valencia, it moved to Antwerp under the guise of a legitimate European import order. Eamon's role was to finance the purchase, arrange the Irish end of the logistics, and ensure distribution once it hit Dublin. Everything went smoothly. The purity was better than most of what was on the market, and Javier proved as dependable as his reputation suggested. Once trust was established, the scale increased. Shipments began arriving quarterly, then monthly, each one slightly larger than the last. Javier wasn't Eamon's only international contact. He also cultivated relationships with Moroccan suppliers who controlled the hashish trade into southern Spain and occasionally offered surplus cocaine from their own South American links. Having multiple points of origin gave Eamon leverage. No single supplier could dictate terms to him. Travel became a quiet but essential part of his work. While some Dublin bosses avoided leaving the city for fear of losing grip on their operations, Eamon made periodic trips to Spain, the Netherlands, and Belgium. These weren't luxury holidays, despite what some onlookers assumed. He stayed in modest hotels under false names, kept meetings brief, and never traveled with more than one trusted associate. In Barcelona, he'd meet Javier in a quiet cafe off the tourist track. In Rotterdam, He'd walk the docks with a port contact who knew which containers would slip through inspection. The international connections also shaped the way Eamon managed risk. In Dublin, a single large seizure could cripple a crew's finances. But with multiple sources feeding his network, a loss in one port didn't shut him down. This redundancy became one of his greatest strengths, and one of the biggest reasons rivals struggled to compete. Maintaining these relationships required more than money. Eamon understood that in the world of international trafficking, trust was a currency you couldn't fake. He paid on time, never quibbled over agreed terms, and didn't push for more than the other side could comfortably deliver. That restraint made him a preferred client in a market where too many buyers demanded too much too fast. There's a story his crew told about a trip to Malaga in which Eamon met a Dutch intermediary named Peter. Peter was known for being cautious to the point of paranoia, often walking away from deals if he sensed even a hint of risk. Over the course of 3 days, Eamon never once pressed him to commit. Instead, he asked questions, listened more than he spoke, and showed genuine interest in Peter's logistics problems. When they finally shook hands, Peter said, "You're the first Irishman I've met who's not in a hurry to get rich." That deal would go on to open a steady flow of smaller, high-purity shipments into Dublin for years. These trips also gave Eamon a broader perspective on the trade. He saw how the same shipment might pass through 3 or 4 different owners before reaching its final destination, each one taking a cut and adding a layer of insulation between the source and the street. He noticed that the most successful operators in Europe weren't the ones with the biggest crews, but the ones who managed information and timing with precision. In turn, he applied those lessons back home. His Dublin network began to operate more like the European models he'd seen, layered, compartmentalized, and resilient. Street-level distributors never dealt directly with import contacts. Couriers were swapped regularly, so no single route could be traced too easily. Safe houses were kept deliberately plain, often in quiet suburbs where no one looked twice at the comings and goings of a self-employed tradesman. Many people still think that these international connections were about chasing bigger profits, but for Eamon, they were about building something that couldn't be knocked over easily. A rival could burn a local supplier or intimidate a nightclub manager, but they couldn't touch a network that stretched from Dublin to Antwerp to Valencia without drawing the attention of people far more dangerous than anyone in Ireland. Of course, these connections came with their own hazards. Foreign suppliers had their own politics, their own feuds, and their own law enforcement threats. If one of Javier's associates was arrested, or if a Rotterdam contact decided to shift allegiance, Eamon could find himself scrambling to replace a key link. That was why he never relied too heavily on any single route, always keeping 2 or 3 viable alternatives ready to activate. By the time 2009 approached, Eamon's reach into Europe was one of the worst-kept secrets in Dublin's gangland. Rivals speculated about how much he was moving. Garda reports hinted at substantial foreign supply channels, and even some of his allies quietly wondered how far he could push it before the weight of international law enforcement caught up. For Eamon, though, the calculus was simple. Dublin was his arena, but Europe was his supply chain, and as long as the chain held, the empire would stand. A growing legend is a dangerous thing in the underworld. It can open doors, command respect, and make people think twice before crossing you. But it can also paint a target so bright that every rival, every Garda unit, and every up-and-comer looking to make their name can see it from miles away. By the time Eamon Dunne's name was being spoken in hushed tones across Dublin, his reputation had already begun to move ahead of him, taking on a life of its own. It didn't start with a single headline or a dramatic police raid. His legend grew quietly, in pub back rooms, at the fringes of nightclub VIP sections, in whispered conversations between men who knew the business well enough to appreciate how rare his kind of operation was. He was the man who could get you what you wanted when everyone else was dry, the one who didn't lose his head when things went sideways, the one whose people didn't talk out of turn. Those stories carried further than he did, and they were repeated often enough that they began to sound like facts, even when they were only half true. What set Eamon apart from many of the men who had held similar positions before him was the way he handled this growing reputation. Some men tried to fan the flames, to become larger-than-life figures who threw parties, posed for photographs, and basked in the attention. Eamon knew better. He understood that the louder you let your legend grow, the shorter your time at the top would be. Instead, he let others tell the stories. He neither confirmed nor denied them. He just kept moving. Of course, there were moments when his growing status worked in his favor. In negotiations, he no longer had to spend time convincing people he was good for the deal. His name did that before he walked in the room. Rivals were more cautious about making moves against him, not because they knew exactly what he'd do in retaliation, but because the uncertainty was enough to give them pause. Even some of the older, more established figures in Dublin's gangland began treating him as an equal, despite his younger age. There's a story about a meeting in a quiet Northside pub that illustrates this perfectly. A visiting figure from the UK, a man known for his own large-scale operations, was in town to discuss a potential joint shipment. He expected to be dealing with someone older, perhaps a bit more desperate to prove themselves. Instead, Eamon arrived in a simple jacket, no entourage, calm and unhurried. The meeting lasted less than an hour, and by the end, the visitor had agreed to terms that heavily favored Eamon's side. When asked later why he'd conceded so much, the man reportedly said, "Because I've heard what happens when you try to cross him, and I've no interest in finding out if it's true." Many people still think that a criminal reputation is built on high-profile acts, spectacular robberies, violent reprisals, or public displays of wealth. But Eamon's was built on something quieter: consistency. Every story about him, whether it was about a clever business move, a narrow escape from Garda attention, or a dispute resolved without bloodshed, reinforced the image of a man who was always in control. The Gardaí noticed this too, though for different reasons. In their reports, his name began appearing more frequently, often accompanied by phrases like "suspected key player" or "likely orchestrator." They had no shortage of informants willing to talk about Eamon's influence, but the lack of direct evidence kept those reports from turning into charges. This only added to the mystique. How could someone with such a presence in the underworld remain untouched? Eamon himself wasn't immune to the subtle power of his own legend. While he didn't go out of his way to court it, he understood that it could be a tool. A carefully timed rumor could discourage a rival from pushing into his territory. A whisper about his connections abroad could make a potential partner more eager to work with him. Even without concrete proof, the belief in his reach was sometimes as effective as the reach itself. But the legend had its drawbacks. It attracted ambitious younger men who wanted to prove themselves by challenging him. It made him a priority target for Garda task forces looking for a headline arrest. And it created a level of expectation that meant any perceived weakness could be exploited quickly. One winter night in 2008, this dynamic played out in a way that could have turned ugly. A small-time crew, eager to make a name, hijacked a shipment they believed belonged to one of Eamon's lesser distributors. The move was reckless, and in most cases, it might have been ignored. Eamon had bigger operations to worry about, but word spread fast, and the story was already mutating into they robbed Eamon's load before the night was over. In a world where perception could be as important as reality, letting that stand was not an option. Instead of sending a wave of muscle after them, Eamon made a single phone call to a man the crew leader owed money to. By the end of the week, the hijacked goods were returned, along with an apology. The young crew survived, but their reputation took a beating, and everyone watching understood the message. You could take a swing at Eamon if you wanted, but the consequences would come from angles you didn't even see. The media eventually caught up with the whispers. Articles began to appear in local papers, some naming him outright, others referring obliquely to a rising figure on the Northside. Journalists speculated about his connections, his earnings, even his personal life. Eamon didn't react publicly. Privately, he tightened his circle and increased the compartmentalization of his operations, knowing that more eyes were now on him than ever before. By 2009, the legend of Eamon Dunne was fully formed. He was seen as untouchable by some, inevitable by others, and a problem to be solved by law enforcement. For better or worse, his name had become a brand in Dublin's underworld, a brand that carried weight in every deal, every negotiation, and every whispered warning. And while Eamon never set out to become a legend, he understood the truth that all who rise in his world eventually learn. Once the story is bigger than you are, you either control it, or it controls you. Trouble in the ranks was something Eamon Dunne had always worked to prevent. From the beginning, he'd built his crew on loyalty, shared profit, and the understanding that stability benefited everyone. But the bigger an operation got, the more people it involved, and the more moving parts there were to manage. By the late 2000s, his network stretched across multiple parts of Dublin into other Irish cities and deep into international supply lines. It was a machine that worked most of the time. The problem with any machine, though, was that one loose bolt in the wrong place could make the whole thing rattle. The first signs weren't obvious. They rarely are. It wasn't a betrayal, not yet, but a shift in tone during conversations, a delay in returning calls, a hint that someone was holding back information. Eamon noticed these things quickly, not because he was paranoid, but because he paid attention. In his world, people didn't drift without reason. If someone in the crew was becoming unreliable, it usually meant they were under pressure, financial, personal, or from a rival offering something tempting. One of his younger lieutenants, Darren, was the first to cause concern. Darren had been with him for years, starting as a street-level distributor before proving himself capable of managing a small team. He was sharp, confident, and ambitious, but ambition, if left unchecked, could be dangerous. Rumors began to circulate that Darren was doing side deals, moving small amounts of product from an outside source to customers he'd cultivated independently. It wasn't enough to cut into Eamon's main business, but it was a breach of trust. Rather than confront him outright, Eamon watched. He had people shadow Darren's movements, not to intimidate him, but to map his activities. The truth was more complicated than he'd expected. Darren had gotten into debt after a series of bad bets on greyhound races. A rival crew had stepped in to cover part of the debt in exchange for just a bit of business on the side. It was a textbook move, using financial pressure to create a foothold inside a rival's operation. Many people still think Eamon would have handled this with immediate violence. Instead, he saw an opportunity to both solve the problem and send a message. He cleared Darren's debt quietly, making it clear that the favor wasn't free. Darren returned fully to the fold, and the rival crew found themselves shut out of several profitable avenues in retaliation. It was a surgical response. No blood, no Garda attention, but a very clear reassertion of control. Not all issues were so neatly resolved. Another problem emerged with a pair of brothers who had been part of the crew's logistics arm for years. They were responsible for transporting shipments from safe houses to distributors, and they had always been dependable. But late in 2008, discrepancies started showing up in the numbers. Small amounts of product missing, cash totals coming up short. At first, it was easy to write off as human error. But the pattern persisted, and the missing amounts, while still relatively small, were consistent enough to raise suspicion. Eamon approached this one differently. He brought the brothers into a private meeting at a neutral location, not one of their usual haunts. The conversation was calm but direct. He laid out the numbers, gave them the chance to explain, and waited. One brother spoke, insisting it was a mix-up in counting. The other stayed silent. Silence in Eamon's experience was rarely the mark of innocence. Within a week, the quiet brother had disappeared from Dublin entirely. No one in the crew ever admitted to knowing where he'd gone, but the thefts stopped immediately. The remaining brother continued working, his performance flawless from then on. Whether that was out of fear, gratitude, or both, Eamon didn't care. What mattered was that the problem was solved, and the message had been sent without a single public act of violence. These internal issues weren't limited to theft or side deals. Sometimes the trouble came from personality clashes. Eamon's crew was made up of strong-willed men, each with their own style, and while that diversity of skill was a strength, it also created friction. One of the more tense rivalries was between his main driver and a mid-tier distributor who handled a lucrative southside route. The driver accused the distributor of being sloppy with security, parking in the same spots too often, using the same routes. The distributor accused the driver of overstepping, claiming he had no right to criticize outside his role. Eamon didn't pick sides publicly. Instead, he restructured the workflow so the two men no longer had to deal with each other directly. The driver's routes were shifted, and the distributor's pickups were handled by a different courier. The move was framed as a routine adjustment, but everyone close to the situation understood it was Eamon's way of diffusing tension before it became something bigger. The challenge of managing a crew this size was that you could never assume silence meant everything was fine. Eamon developed a habit of meeting with his inner circle individually, rather than always in a group. In one-on-one conversations, people were more likely to reveal grievances, concerns, or suspicions. These meetings weren't interrogations. They often happened over a pint or during a casual drive. But they gave Eamon a constant read on the mood inside his organization. There's a saying in the underworld that most trouble comes from inside your own walls. Eamon took that seriously. He knew that while rivals could hurt you, it was the cracks in your own structure that could bring you down completely. That was why he invested as much energy in maintaining loyalty and cohesion as he did in securing supply lines or expanding territory. Still, he wasn't naive. He understood that in an environment built on secrecy, greed, and risk, there would always be people who tested the boundaries. His job was to catch them early, decide whether they could be brought back into line, and act decisively when they couldn't. Sometimes that meant a second chance. Sometimes it meant quietly cutting someone loose. And sometimes, though he avoided it when possible, it meant eliminating the threat entirely. By 2009, the size and complexity of his operation meant that trouble in the ranks was no longer a rare event. It was an ongoing challenge. But Eamon's ability to address these problems without letting them spiral into public feuds was part of what kept his empire intact, while others around him were tearing themselves apart from the inside. The unspoken truth was that he couldn't prevent every betrayal, every theft, every clash of egos. What he could do, and what he did better than most, was ensure that when trouble came, it was dealt with quickly, quietly, and in a way that reminded everyone why his word was law. Feuds erupting in Dublin's gangland were nothing new, but by the time Eamon Dunne had cemented his place at the top of the Northside, the scale and speed at which violence could flare had changed. Years earlier, disputes over territory or unpaid debts might simmer for months before boiling over. Now, with the market moving faster, money changing hands in larger amounts, and reputations built on instant perceptions, trouble could ignite in a single night. For Eamon, avoiding unnecessary wars was a cornerstone of his philosophy. He knew the costs. Feuds drained resources, disrupted supply chains, and brought the kind of Garda attention that was impossible to shake. But he also understood that some conflicts couldn't be sidestepped forever. By 2009, tensions between his network and a mid-tier crew on the Northside had reached the point where even his patience couldn't hold the line. It started over a distributor named Kali, who had been running product for Eamon for nearly 3 years. Kali was steady, reliable, and had a loyal customer base in a cluster of housing estates. But he'd also grown close to a rival crew leader named Liam Oor, an ambitious operator with a taste for confrontation. At first, the overlap didn't seem like a problem. Eamon assumed Kali knew better than to mix business. Then small warning signs began to appear. Late payments, vague explanations about missing stock, and a noticeable drop in the quality of information Kali passed up the chain. When Eamon pressed for answers, he learned that Liam's crew had been moving into Kali's area, offering cheaper product and pressuring some of his regular customers to switch over. Worse, Liam had reportedly told people that Eamon's hold on the Northside was slipping. Whether or not it was true, the rumor alone was a threat. Perception in the underworld was as dangerous as bullets. Many people still think that Eamon's first move in a situation like this would be immediate retaliation. In reality, he began by trying to undercut Liam economically. Prices in the contested area dropped, quality went up, and the margins on Eamon's side narrowed almost to nothing. It wasn't about profit. It was about making it impossible for Liam's expansion to pay off. The strategy worked for a time, but Liam didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down, bringing in outside muscle from a Southside affiliate to push harder. The turning point came one Friday night outside a pub on the edge of the contested territory. 2 of Eamon's younger distributors were jumped by masked men and beaten badly enough to send them to hospital. No money or product was taken. It was a message. The next morning, Eamon met with his core crew. His tone was calm, but the decision was made. This wasn't going to be solved with price wars anymore. The response was swift, but calculated. Within a week, 3 of Liam's mid-level sellers were quietly approached with offers they couldn't refuse. Better product, safer routes, and the implicit protection of working under Eamon's name. One took the deal immediately, another within a month, and the third vanished from the scene entirely after his car was found burned out in a quiet industrial estate. No arrests were made, and no witnesses came forward. Liam, now short on manpower and watching his territory erode, lashed out. Shots were fired at one of Eamon's known hangouts late on a Tuesday night. No one was hit, but the escalation was clear. This was the kind of act that risked drawing full-blown gangland attention. Eamon's retaliation was decisive. A warehouse Liam used for storage was raided in the middle of the night. Not by gardaí, but by masked men who stripped it clean. By morning, Liam's crew had lost a significant shipment and the ability to operate in that area. The feud burned hot for another month before a quiet sit-down was arranged through mutual contacts. The meeting wasn't about reconciliation. It was about survival. Liam agreed to pull back from certain estates in exchange for being left to operate unchallenged in other areas. For Eamon, it was a win. He regained control where it mattered most without committing to an endless cycle of public reprisals. This wasn't the only flare-up during his reign. In the same year, a smaller crew in Finglas tried to muscle into one of his southside nightclub routes. Their leader, a volatile figure named Brendan Doyle, made the mistake of confronting one of Eamon's distributors directly, demanding a cut. The distributor stalled, passed word up the chain, and within days, Brendan found his access to several key venues cut off. The bouncers, men with quiet ties to Eamon's network, suddenly refused him entry, and the DJs stopped taking his calls for bookings he used as a cover for business. By the time he realized what was happening, Brendan's nightlife income had dried up, and he no longer had the resources to challenge anyone. Eamon's handling of these feuds showed a clear pattern. He avoided open street battles when possible, preferring to bleed rivals of their resources, isolate them socially, and cripple their operations from the inside. Violence was used, but sparingly, and always as part of a broader strategy. He understood that a single high-profile killing could bring more heat from the gardaí than months of low-level economic warfare. Of course, there were times when the threat of violence was the only language left to speak. In one instance, a mid-tier distributor within his own ranks began skimming from shipments and selling the excess to an outside crew. When confronted, the man denied it. The next week, his car was found riddled with bullets in an industrial park. He wasn't inside at the time. The message was enough. The theft stopped immediately. Many people still think of Eamon as someone who avoided confrontation at all costs, but the truth was more nuanced. He avoided pointless confrontation. If a feud could be ended without unnecessary bloodshed, he would take that route. But if the situation demanded a show of force, he made sure it was delivered in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. By the close of 2009, Eamon had navigated multiple disputes without allowing any of them to spiral into the kind of chaos that could destabilize his empire. Rivals still existed, and grudges still simmered, but the message was clear. Crossing him was costly, and winning against him required more than just bravado. In Dublin's gangland, feuds were as inevitable as rain in November. The difference was that Eamon treated them like storms, something to be weathered with preparation, calculation, and the understanding that, when they passed, the landscape would always look a little different. By early 2010, Dublin's criminal underworld was moving with a kind of restless energy that made even veterans uneasy. The economic recession had cut deep into legitimate businesses, and that desperation spilled over into the streets. People who might have stayed in their lanes before were now willing to take risks, sometimes reckless ones, to carve out a slice of the illicit market. For Eamon Dunne, this meant that every week seemed to bring a new opportunity wrapped in potential disaster. On the surface, his empire was holding steady. The Northside was still his base. His network of distributors was loyal enough to keep product moving, and his relationships with certain nightclub owners, security companies, and transport contacts were stronger than ever. But under the surface, the very breadth of his reach was beginning to pull at the seams. Managing operations in multiple districts, keeping suppliers happy, and ensuring the Gardaí didn't have a single clear target to hit. It was a balancing act that required constant vigilance. One of the most pressing issues was the influx of Eastern European gangs into the Dublin scene. Some came for the booming drug trade, others to establish footholds for stolen goods and counterfeit markets. Eamon was pragmatic about them. If they didn't interfere with his core business, they were potential partners. But if they tried to muscle in, he had no problem showing that the Northside wasn't open territory. A case in point was the arrival of a small but ambitious group from Lithuania, led by a man known on the street as Viktoras. Tall, lean, and with an unblinking stare that unsettled even seasoned locals, Viktoras ran a crew that specialized in high-purity cocaine, sourced directly from continental Europe. Word was, their shipments bypassed traditional Irish intermediaries, which allowed them to undercut prices and control supply. At first, they operated mostly in the suburbs, avoiding direct competition. Then, one of Eamon's distributors in Ballymun reported that his best customers were switching over to the foreign lads. Eamon didn't see this as a problem that could be solved with brute force. Instead, he sent two of his trusted lieutenants to meet Viktoras in a neutral pub. The conversation was polite, but edged with warning. Eamon's side suggested a supply arrangement. Viktoras could move product in certain areas, but a cut would come back to the Northside. Viktoras smiled, agreed to consider it, and never called back. Within weeks, the price war began. Rather than panic, Eamon doubled down on quality. He sourced a batch from a long-time contact in Spain, more expensive, but potent enough that word of mouth spread quickly. Simultaneously, he quietly reached out to one of Viktoras's couriers, a man with a gambling habit and a habit of complaining about his boss. Within a month, the courier had switched sides, bringing with him valuable details about drop locations, stash houses, and shipping routes. The decisive blow came one damp Thursday night. A storage unit rented under a false name was hit by unknown raiders, though the timing suggested inside information. The entire stock was gone by morning, and Viktoras's crew was left scrambling. By the following week, they had pulled most of their operations out of Eamon's territory. No blood spilled, no public fireworks, just quiet dominance restored. Not all threats were handled so cleanly. Around the same time, a Southside crew with loose connections to older gangland figures began testing boundaries. They started with nightclub supply, sending feelers into venues where Eamon's people worked the door. At first, it was just whispers, offering slightly better deals to customers inside. But then, one of Eamon's distributors was caught in a heated argument with a Southside operator in a bathroom queue. The shouting spilled out into the main floor, and by the time security intervened, the damage was done. The incident made its way back to Eamon, who viewed it not as an isolated argument, but as a challenge. His retaliation was subtle, but effective. Two of the Southside crew's regular pickup cars were stopped by Gardaí within days of each other, tipped off by anonymous information. The searches didn't lead to major arrests, but the disruption was enough to stall their expansion. Eamon's contacts in the club scene also made sure that these rivals found it harder to book private areas for business, cutting off their best venues for discreet deals. Many people still think that Eamon's ability to win these battles came purely from intimidation, but in truth, it was his skill in reading the game several moves ahead. He knew which fights to escalate and which to smother before they had the chance to grow. In a city where hot tempers could undo years of work, his restraint was one of his most dangerous weapons, but restraint had its limits. In March 2010, an incident occurred that tested the very foundation of his reputation. A shipment destined for one of his most profitable Northside routes went missing. At first, it was assumed to be a Garda seizure, but quiet inquiries revealed a more troubling truth. The load had been intercepted by a rogue element within his own extended network. The culprits weren't strangers. They were former associates of a mid-tier operator who had fallen out with Eamon months earlier. The theft was an open insult, and worse, it risked making Eamon look vulnerable. He acted quickly, convening a meeting with his core crew in a back room of a warehouse. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken questions. His decision was clear. The stolen shipment would be recovered, and those responsible would be made examples of, not through public spectacle, but in a way that would leave no doubt about the reach of his hand. The operation to retrieve the product was carried out with military precision. Surveillance confirmed the stash location, a converted lockup in a quiet estate. One rainy night, a van pulled up, 4 men stepped out, and within 20 minutes, the lockup was empty again. No alarms, no police calls, just the quiet movement of goods back to their rightful owner. By the end of the week, the ringleader of the theft had left Dublin entirely, his departure unannounced, but widely noted. That spring, the pattern of challenges continued. Each rival, whether foreign crew, ambitious local, or disloyal insider, was met with the same blend of patience, leverage, and decisive timing. To the Gardaí watching from the outside, it might have looked like Eamon's empire was on a knife's edge. To those inside, it was simply the way the Northside Dawn operated, calmly, quietly, always in control, until the moment he chose not to be. By mid-2010, the air in Dublin's underworld felt heavy, as if the whole city was waiting for something to break. The clubs were still crowded, deals were still happening behind closed doors, and couriers were still darting through quiet streets at odd hours, but there was an edge to everything. The Gardaí's organized crime unit had stepped up its presence, especially in the Northside, and rival factions were probing for any weakness in Eamon Dunne's defenses. Eamon, for his part, seemed unbothered. He carried himself as though the streets were still firmly in his pocket. In many ways they were, but the margins for error were shrinking. One mistake could unravel months of careful positioning, and he knew it. He started relying more heavily on a small inner circle of people he trusted absolutely. These weren't necessarily the loudest or most visible figures in his crew. Some were soft-spoken, almost invisible in public, but they had proven themselves in ways that mattered. Loyalty, discretion, and a willingness to act without hesitation when called upon. The first major test of that summer came from an unexpected direction. A West Dublin crew, traditionally more concerned with local disputes, began sniffing around the Northside's wholesale supply chain. They weren't trying to muscle in on street-level sales. Instead, they were making overtures to mid-level distributors, offering them a better rate if they shifted allegiance. This was dangerous ground. If Eamon's supply chain started to fracture, the ripple effects would be immediate. Less product moving, less money coming in, and a perception of weakness that could invite even bolder challenges. Rather than confront the West Dublin crew directly, Eamon decided to tighten the loyalty of his existing distributors. He rolled out a temporary price cut for those within his network, absorbing the loss himself. It was a calculated move. Short-term pain for long-term security. At the same time, he had his lieutenants quietly track every conversation happening between his people and the West Dublin emissaries. Within a fortnight, he had a complete picture of who had taken the bait, who had refused, and who was sitting on the fence. One defection in particular stung. A distributor named Colum, who had been with the network for over 3 years. Eamon arranged a meeting, ostensibly to clear the air. It took place in the upstairs office of a car garage, the kind of place where no one asked questions about comings and goings. The conversation was direct. Eamon didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply laid out the facts of Colum's decision and the consequences that followed. By the end of the meeting, Colum had agreed to cut ties with the West Dublin crew and work exclusively for Eamon again. Whether it was the words themselves or the weight behind them that swayed him, no one could say. But word of the meeting spread, and the trickle of potential defections stopped. While these domestic matters kept him busy, an international thread was also tugging at the edges of his empire. A contact in Spain had hinted at a potential new supply route, one that bypassed certain traditional choke points and could significantly lower costs. The route involved moving product through a port city in northern France before shipping it in smaller quantities to Ireland via fishing vessels. It was riskier than the usual channels, but the potential rewards were enormous. Eamon was intrigued. He sent 2 men he trusted to scout the logistics, paying them well to spend 2 weeks embedded in the French port, learning the rhythms of the dock workers, the port authorities, and the local underworld. They returned with encouraging news. The route was viable, but only if Eamon could guarantee consistent demand on his end. That meant keeping his Dublin operation rock solid, with no room for the kind of internal instability that rivals were trying to provoke. By August, his attention was pulled back to a simmering issue closer to home. The Lithuanian crew, which he had thought handled months earlier, was making quiet moves again. This time, by partnering with a small but volatile group of young Northside dealers. These were kids barely out of their teens, eager for fast money and unconcerned with the politics of territory. The Lithuanians supplied them with high-purity cocaine, and the youngsters flooded certain estates with product, undercutting Eamon's own distributors. It wasn't just about lost sales, it was about precedent. If these new players could operate with impunity, others would follow. Eamon sent a message through intermediaries, offering the Lithuanians a buyout, cash in exchange for pulling their product from those estates. They refused, perhaps thinking Eamon was losing his touch, so he took another route. He leaned on his contacts in the local pubs, making it harder for the young dealers to use their usual meeting spots. At the same time, he quietly encouraged Garda patrols in the targeted estates, ensuring that anyone moving conspicuously was stopped and questioned. The combination of social pressure and police heat began to squeeze the operation. Within 6 weeks, the youngsters were out of the game. Their alliance with the Lithuanians dissolved. Many people still think that Eamon's real genius lay in violence, but the truth is more complicated. Yes, he could be ruthless when necessary, but his preferred tools were patience, leverage, and an uncanny ability to see where the next problem would emerge. Violence was the last card, not the first. This is what kept his network relatively stable, even when Dublin's criminal scene was in flux. That autumn, however, stability began to feel like an illusion. The Gardaí were tightening their net, not just on Eamon, but on organized crime as a whole. Raids became more frequent. Surveillance cameras were spotted outside venues known to host meetings. One evening in October, as Eamon left a quiet dinner with two of his oldest associates, he noticed an unmarked car shadowing his movements. It peeled away after a few blocks, but the message was clear. He was under watch. Inside his own circle, there were whispers about increased Garda focus on a few of his mid-level operators. One was questioned for hours about Eamon's movements. Another found his house searched under a warrant, with officers taking his phone and computer. While nothing immediate came of these actions, they created a sense of pressure, a low hum of paranoia that could fray even the tightest bonds. Eamon began holding fewer in-person meetings, relying more on indirect communication and trusted go-betweens. It slowed certain operations, but also made it harder for anyone to tie him directly to illicit deals. The trade-off was worth it, at least for the moment. But in the back of his mind, he knew that the kind of heat he was feeling rarely cooled off on its own. Something would have to give. As the year wound toward its close, Dublin's nights grew colder, and the city's underworld seemed to shiver with it. Rivalries had been checked, supply lines were still flowing, and the new French route was tentatively in place. Yet Eamon could sense the shift, subtle but undeniable. It was in the way people paused before answering certain questions, in the way familiar streets seemed to hold new eyes watching from shadowed corners. For all his composure, he was not blind to the reality. A storm was forming over the Northside, and even the dawn of Dublin could only hold the line for so long. Winter's grip on Dublin in early 2010 brought with it a deceptive calm. To the ordinary pedestrian trudging down O'Connell Street in the frost-bitten evenings, the city was simply enduring another cold season. But in the enclaves of Eamon Dunne's domain, the chill in the air wasn't just from the weather. Beneath the frost lay tension, thin as glass, but ready to shatter with one hard move. Eamon's operation was still humming, product moving steadily, money flowing in a rhythm that seemed unbroken. But he knew enough about power to recognize that nothing stayed unchallenged for long. The Gardaí were intensifying surveillance with methods he'd not seen in years. Even when he didn't spot the cars or the plainclothes officers, he could sense their presence. He adjusted accordingly, changing cars twice in a single journey, altering his patterns so no 2 weeks looked the same, and keeping his meetings even shorter than before. Yet the greater concern came not from law enforcement, but from the fragile alliances that held Dublin's criminal ecosystem together. His uneasy truce with the West Dublin crew had cooled to a simmer after the summer standoff, but now small signs suggested they were testing the waters again. A single shipment had gone missing in transit, a breach that might have been written off as bad luck if it hadn't been followed by a suspiciously timed street rumor that Eamon's once feared network was showing cracks. He didn't waste time with a public show of force. Instead, he worked the quieter levers of influence. An associate of the West Dublin crew was invited to a high-stakes poker night in a back room above a Northside pub. It wasn't about the cards, it was about the conversation. The man left with his pockets heavier and his tone more cautious. Word filtered back that West Dublin was, at least temporarily, backing off. Meanwhile, the French supply route was beginning to show promise. The first 3 test shipments had come through without incident, hidden in the cold holds of fishing trawlers that smelled so thoroughly of the sea that even a curious customs officer wouldn't have lingered. The margins were better than expected, enough to tempt Eamon to expand the channel. But expanding meant more moving parts, more people in the know, and more opportunities for things to go wrong. Still, the lure was strong. The established channels through Spain and the Netherlands were efficient but expensive. This new French route undercut them and gave him leverage when negotiating with existing suppliers. By December, he had committed to making it a regular line, assigning 2 trusted men to oversee every stage from dock to Dublin Street. He didn't yet realize it, but this decision would later be one of the last calculated risks he took on his own terms. In parallel, the Lithuanian issue had not died as completely as he'd believed. While their teenage proxies were gone, the Lithuanians had shifted tactics, funneling product into Dublin through a separate, smaller distributor who specialized in nightlife venues. It was a clever play, less visible than street dealing, more insulated from Garda interference, and appealing to a different clientele. Eamon noticed the signs in late December. A club in Drumcondra, where his own product had always held sway, now carried a rival brand. Bartenders whose loyalty he'd counted on were suddenly vague when asked about the source of their weekend extras. This wasn't an existential threat yet, but it was the kind of rot that, if ignored, could spread quickly. Rather than react immediately, Eamon made the strategic choice to observe. He had one of his younger lieutenants, sharp-eyed, with a knack for blending in, start frequenting the venues in question, making friends, listening for the casual slip-ups that people make after a few drinks. By the first week of January, they had mapped the Lithuanian club route in detail. On the personal side, Eamon's life had become a careful balance between visibility and invisibility. Too much time in public risked attracting unwanted eyes. Too little risked eroding the aura of control that came from being seen, being known. He handled it with precision, appearing at select pubs, paying for rounds, checking in on old friends in the open, then disappearing for days into the private spaces where the real business was done. It was during one of these quieter stretches that he began to notice something subtle but telling in his inner circle. A few of his longest-serving men had grown hesitant, their usual decisiveness dulled by the growing weight of police scrutiny. Conversations that once flowed freely now had pauses where there had been none. When asked about certain deliveries, 1 or 2 responded with overly detailed explanations, too careful, too rehearsed. Eamon had built his career on reading people, on spotting the shift in tone that meant trouble. These weren't yet betrayals, but they were cracks, and cracks in the foundation, if left alone, only widened. The Gardaí, perhaps sensing an opportunity, began hitting the Northside harder in early February. Raids on small-time dealers connected loosely to his network were reported in the papers. It wasn't the size of the seizures that mattered. It was the psychological effect. The message was that no one was untouchable, not even those operating in Eamon's shadow. One of these raids resulted in the arrest of a young dealer who had recently been promoted within the network. The kid didn't know much about the higher tiers, but he knew enough to cause trouble if he panicked under questioning. For 2 tense days, no one knew what he might say. When he was released without charge, Eamon breathed easier, but only slightly. The Gardaí didn't need immediate convictions. Sometimes planting seeds of doubt was just as effective. By late February, an unexpected ripple hit from outside Dublin. A contact from Spain, a man who had been part of Eamon's earliest international dealings, sent word that one of their mutual suppliers had been taken down in a massive European sting. The immediate impact was minor, as Eamon had diversified his sources, but the broader implication was worrying. Law enforcement in multiple countries were now coordinating at a level he hadn't encountered before. What was once a local or national cat-and-mouse game was becoming an international hunt. Even so, there were moments when Eamon could still convince himself the balance was holding. A Friday night at his favorite spot on the Northside, a drink in hand, the familiar hum of conversations around him. It could almost feel like the old days. But the old days were gone, and deep down, he knew it. Every smile from an associate, every handshake in a crowded bar carried the unspoken question, how much longer can this last? And somewhere in that winter's quiet, under the frost and the street lamps and the watchful eyes of both allies and enemies, the answer was beginning to form. It would not come in the way anyone expected, but when it did, it would be sudden, irreversible, and final. March arrived with a thin light that stretched across Dublin's rooftops, a reminder that winter was loosening its grip. But for Eamon Dunne, the shifting season did little to thaw the pressures building around him. The city was waking up, markets busier, pubs filling earlier in the evening. But so too were the eyes watching him. Each sunrise seemed to bring fresh whispers, some close enough to feel like warm breath on the back of his neck. His network, though still functional, was beginning to feel like an elaborate clock that had been running too long without maintenance. The gears still turned, the chimes still rang on time, but he could hear a faint grind in the background, a friction that shouldn't be there. Deliveries made it to their destinations, but the drivers now made more calls than usual to confirm small details. Meetings that once ended in a single handshake now seemed to require extra assurances. The West Dublin crew had stayed quiet through the winter, but in early March, word drifted in from a reliable source. One of their lieutenants had been seen talking with a mid-tier figure from the Northside, one who owed his position to Eamon. That conversation, in the wrong place at the wrong time, meant two things. Either the lieutenant was fishing for opportunities, or someone inside Eamon's structure was softening toward a rival. Neither was acceptable. He dealt with it in his usual way. Subtle pressure, no theatrics. A quiet visit to the mid-tier man's home, just him and one trusted enforcer. No shouting, no threats, just a conversation over tea. By the end, the man's voice had lost its earlier confidence, and his eyes avoided direct contact. A week later, the same man was seen publicly making small but deliberate gestures of loyalty to Eamon, paying a bar tab in his name, escorting one of his closest lieutenants to a meeting. The West Dublin lieutenant, meanwhile, stopped appearing on the Northside altogether. Yet even as he closed one small leak, another began to form. The French route, which had been a growing asset, suddenly encountered turbulence. In late March, one of the fishing trawlers was held longer than usual at a Breton port. No cargo was found, but the delay alone was enough to spook the captain, a man whose courage was measured in euros and whose loyalty stopped at the edge of his own skin. He demanded higher pay for the risk and hinted that he might be done with that side of the business altogether. Eamon faced a choice: replace him with another captain, or agree to the new terms and preserve the route. He chose the latter. It was expensive, yes, but stability was worth more than savings at that moment. The French shipments were too clean, too dependable to gamble with. Besides, replacing the captain meant introducing a new person to the details of the route. And every new person was a potential loose end. In April, the Gardaí made another move, one that seemed minor in headlines but major in its implications. A mid-level distributor from the southside was picked up, questioned, and released the same day. Officially, it was routine, but Eamon knew better. The southside man was an occasional collaborator, the kind of figure who could pass messages across territories without anyone asking too many questions. If the Gardaí were questioning him, they were mapping lines that Eamon had worked hard to blur. He called in his core group for a meeting. Not the whole network, just the ones who actually mattered when things tightened. It was a rare thing for him to gather them in one place, rarer still to do it without drinks or cards on the table. They talked business, yes, but the real purpose was to look each man in the eye, to weigh their posture, their tone, their willingness to meet his gaze. Some of them still radiated the sharp confidence that had built their empire. Others, he noticed, shifted in their chairs, glanced at their phones more than once, or nodded too quickly at his statements. Those tells stayed with him long after the meeting broke up. By May, his instincts told him that the danger was no longer just from the outside. The Gardaí, the rival crews, even the Lithuanians, they were all threats he could manage. But the slow seep of doubt inside his own ranks was something harder to stop. It didn't announce itself with sirens or sudden violence. It came quietly, like water under a door, and before you realized it, the floor was wet. He began to spend more time alone, moving between safe flats, driving unmarked routes through the city at odd hours. Sometimes, in the early morning, he would sit in a parked car along the quays, watching the lights shimmer on the Liffey, and think about the old days, when ambition felt like a gift, not a burden. There were still flashes of the old thrill. A night in late May, for instance, when a shipment came in from Spain under the cover of a crowded port festival. He walked into a warehouse lit only by a single hanging bulb and saw the packages laid out, untouched. Perfect. He smiled, a real one, and felt for a moment the same satisfaction he'd known years earlier when the game was new, but the high faded quickly. The following week, a contact in the Netherlands sent a clipped, almost anxious message. A European task force was sharing intelligence on Irish operations with law enforcement in Dublin. That meant patterns, routes, and possibly names were being analyzed far from the city's streets. Through June, he tightened things even further. More layers between him and the street, more insulation from day-to-day handling of shipments. To the outside eye, he might have seemed more secure than ever. But to those who truly understood the business, the shift was telling. When a man like Eamon starts stepping back from the front line, it's because he knows the ground is changing under his feet. On a humid evening in late June, as he sat in the corner of a quiet pub nursing a drink, he noticed two plainclothes Gardaí at the far end of the bar. They didn't approach, didn't even look at him directly, but their presence was deliberate. It was a message without words. "We see you." Eamon finished his drink slowly, placed the glass down with care, and walked out without a backward glance. He knew what they were doing, chipping away at his sense of invisibility, one silent encounter at a time. And he also knew it was working, if only slightly. Still, he told himself, the clock was not yet out of time. He had survived longer than most in Dublin's underworld, and if he had to adjust, he would. The question, which he carried with him into the thickening heat of July, was whether he would be the one to make the final move, or whether someone else was already setting the board for his last game. July pressed its weight onto Dublin like a damp wool blanket. The air carried a heaviness that clung to skin, the kind that made tempers shorter and patience thinner. For Eamon Dunne, that weight was more than just weather. It was the pressure of converging forces, all circling in tighter arcs than they had just months before. In the first week of the month, one of his longest-standing contacts in Spain abruptly cut communication. There had been no quarrel, no missed payment, no breach of trust. But when one of Eamon's middlemen tried to confirm the next shipment, all he got in reply was a terse voice note. "Too hot, not worth it. We'll speak next year." It was the kind of withdrawal that didn't need elaboration. Somewhere along the line, that contact had decided his best chance of survival was to vanish from the chain. This was troubling for more than just the loss of product. That particular route had been a backbone connection for Eamon's operation, reliable, discreet, and with a rhythm that allowed for planning months in advance. Its sudden disappearance forced him to juggle the rest of the network, pushing more weight onto the French route and the smaller Baltic line. These routes could handle the load in theory, but in practice, they strained under the extra shipments, raising the risk of exposure. The strain also bled into his crew. Meetings became longer, discussions sharper, the pauses between replies thicker with calculation. He noticed that when he entered a room, the conversation often dipped just slightly before picking up again. It was subtle, but to someone with his instincts, it was like hearing a faint ticking under floorboards. You couldn't ignore it. Mid-month, an incident at a Northside pub made that ticking louder. One of his lieutenants, a man known for a quick temper, got into a late-night brawl with a younger enforcer from the West Dublin crew. The fight itself was nothing unusual. Dublin pubs have seen worse over spilled drinks and stray glances, but the context was off. The younger man had no business being in that pub, and yet he arrived already carrying barbed remarks about Eamon's leadership. Someone had fed him lines, and the fact that he spoke them so freely suggested he wasn't afraid of the consequences. Eamon didn't handle this through violence. Instead, he called in the lieutenant privately, listened to his version, and then asked one quiet question. "Who benefits from you losing your head in front of a room like that?" The lieutenant didn't answer, but his eyes flickered in a way that told Eamon he understood. Within a week, the younger enforcer had been relocated. No drama, just reassigned to a low-profile role far from the Northside. But the ripple was there. People noticed. Through late July, the Gardaí made their own moves. They increased random checkpoints along the M1 and M50, especially in the hours just before dawn, prime time for certain deliveries. 2 vans connected to Eamon's logistics chain were stopped in the same week. No contraband was found, but both drivers were kept waiting at the roadside long enough for the message to sink in. Their routines were known. It was around this time that a source, one of those quiet figures who had made a living skimming from multiple sides without anyone catching him, slipped Eamon a troubling detail. According to chatter from within the Gardaí, there was a task force forming whose focus wasn't drugs, guns, or smuggling in general. It was names, and Eamon's was first on the list, not near the top. First, that knowledge sharpened everything. He stopped taking calls from certain numbers, rerouted meetings to more public places where sudden disappearances were less likely, and doubled his safe house rotation. He also began limiting his movements to only those escorted by 2 or more trusted men. By early August, the noose was tightening in ways that weren't visible to the public, but were unmistakable in the world Eamon inhabited. A Lithuanian contact, who had once bragged about his ability to move anything, anywhere, began dragging his feet on fulfilling orders. A meeting that should have taken place in person was suddenly downgraded to a phone call, with vague assurances that circumstances had changed. The change, Eamon suspected, wasn't in Lithuania. It was here, in Dublin, where whispers about him were no longer just background noise. They were shaping decisions in other countries. His allies were recalculating his lifespan, and some had clearly decided not to be too close when the clock struck midnight. The irony was that on the surface, he still looked like the Don of the Northside. He still arrived at certain pubs to respectful nods. His name still opened doors in clubs and closed tabs without a bill. But he knew, in the same way a man knows when a tooth is rotting under the gum, that his position was becoming brittle. One evening in mid-August, he met with a small circle of his earliest associates in the back room of a restaurant they'd been using for over a decade. Over plates of lamb stew and glasses of red wine, they spoke about the old days, about the years when ambition had been fresh and the streets felt wide open. But beneath the nostalgia, there was a silence none of them dared to fill. They all knew they were talking as if looking back, not forward. By the time September rolled in with its gray skies and steady rain, the tension was thick enough to taste. Even the young runners who worked the lower levels of the operation seemed more cautious, less eager to be seen at the wrong place in the wrong time. A few disappeared altogether. One left a note saying he'd gone to London for a fresh start, which, in their world, meant he didn't trust the city to stay safe much longer. Eamon, meanwhile, started setting aside time each week to review his own contingencies. Bank accounts in other names, properties under shells, cars stashed in locked garages. He didn't plan to run, at least not yet, but the thought had moved from the abstract to the practical. One rainy night in late September, he stood at the window of a high-rise flat, watching the city lights blur in the downpour. Somewhere out there, he knew, people were having conversations about him, whether to back him, betray him, or simply let him burn himself out. The city that had once been his playground had become a chessboard, and he was no longer certain he controlled all the pieces. As lightning flickered in the distance, he thought of something an old associate once told him. You're never out until they forget your name, and they don't forget until you're in the ground. It wasn't fear that tightened in his chest that night. It was the cold clarity of a man who knew the board was shifting faster than he could move. And yet, he still had moves left. The question was whether he could make them in time. October came in with a deceptive calm. The first weeks brought fewer headlines about shootings or seizures, fewer roadside checkpoints, even fewer whispers in the pubs. To the average Dubliner, it might have looked like the storm had passed, but Eamon Dunne knew better. In his world, quiet wasn't peace. It was pressure building somewhere out of sight. The month started with a peculiar meeting at a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place used for storing cargo that arrived under vague invoices. The meeting wasn't on his calendar. It had been requested through one of those convoluted channels meant to disguise who was really asking. When Eamon arrived, he found 3 men he didn't know sitting at a folding table in the far corner. They had the look of mid-level operators from the continent. Sharp suits, plain faces, and that practiced stillness that came from having survived their share of ugly business. They got straight to the point. The market was shifting, routes were changing, and certain Dublin players might soon find themselves without a chair when the music stopped. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but the implication was clear. If Eamon wanted a place in the new arrangement, he'd have to step back from some of his territory and agree to joint operations under their terms. He listened politely, sipped the bitter coffee they'd offered, and gave no commitments. But inside, he was running the calculation. Accepting their terms might buy him breathing room, but it would also be an admission that his grip on the Northside was slipping. Declining might keep his pride intact, but would likely accelerate the moves being made against him. Back in his apartment that night, he sat with a map spread across the kitchen table. Small notes marked drop points, storage sites, pubs, and houses of allies. He traced the lines between them with the tip of a pen, seeing the network not as streets and addresses, but as veins feeding a living thing. Cutting off one route might weaken him, but severing too many would kill the body entirely. Mid-October brought another sign of the shifting ground. A trusted courier failed to arrive for a pickup, and by the time Eamon's men tracked him down, the courier was already on a flight to Canada. No warning, no goodbye. He'd left behind an apartment with rent paid 6 months in advance and a car with the keys still in the ignition. People don't leave like that unless they're running from something they believe will catch them before morning. The gardii, meanwhile, seemed to resurface with a renewed appetite. 2 small stash houses were raided within the same week. Neither was directly linked to Eamon, but the proximity and timing made it obvious these weren't random hits. Someone had been talking, and the authorities were using the information like breadcrumbs to circle closer to him. In late October, Eamon attended a wedding in the countryside for an old friend's daughter. It should have been a light-hearted break, a chance to drink and dance and be surrounded by people who knew him before the headlines. Instead, he found himself scanning the crowd, noting who avoided his gaze, who whispered after he passed. Even in that rural hall, decorated with flowers and full of music, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of his world were leaning inward. On the drive back to Dublin, rain streaking the windscreen, he told his driver to take the long route. They cut through smaller roads, past dark fields and shuttered petrol stations. At one point, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror and stayed there for nearly 15 minutes. Eamon said nothing, but the driver made 3 deliberate turns before the lights finally peeled away. They didn't need to speak about it. Both men knew it had been a tale. Whether gardii or rivals, it didn't matter. The fact it had happened out here, away from the city, was a new kind of message. By November, paranoia had stopped being a bad habit and become an operating principle. Eamon altered his appearance subtly. Different jackets, different hats, even changing the way he walked in public. He rotated between 3 apartments, never sleeping in the same bed more than 2 nights in a row. And still, he felt eyes on him. The shift in weather mirrored the shift in his life. Winter crept into Dublin with early darkness and cold winds off the Liffey. The streets felt sharper, the air thinner. Old alliances were fraying. One associate in the north of the city failed to return calls for days, only to finally answer with vague reassurances and a hollow tone. Another, in the south, insisted they were still tight, but was spotted having dinner with a man known to be courting Eamon's rivals. In mid-November, a shipment through the Baltic line vanished entirely. The men meant to receive it in Dublin swore they'd been in position all night, but the container never arrived. The paperwork claimed it had been diverted due to port delays, but Eamon knew that was fiction. Someone had intercepted it before it reached Irish soil. He tried to respond in the old way. Calls to contacts, demands for answers, subtle threats to anyone stalling. But each thread he pulled seemed to unravel further, leading not to clarity, but to more empty spaces. The Dublin he had ruled was now a chessboard where pieces moved without his hand. By December, the cold was deep, and so was the isolation. He still commanded respect in some circles, but the tone had shifted from loyalty to wary courtesy. People smiled when they saw him, but their eyes flicked toward the exits. pubs where he'd once been greeted like family now greeted him like a customer, polite, efficient, but distant. Christmas approached with its usual chaos in the city. Lights strung over streets, shop windows dressed in red and gold, crowds hustling with bags and scarves. Eamon walked among them one evening, blending into the rush, and wondered how many of these strangers knew his name. He thought of that old saying again, "They only forget when you're in the ground." That night, he returned to one of his safe houses, a narrow terrace house with peeling paint and a faulty heater. He poured himself a whiskey, sat in the dim light, and considered the map again. But now, instead of tracing the lines of his empire, he began crossing out the points that no longer felt safe. By the time he was done, half the map was marked with X's. He stared at what was left. It was still something, but it was no longer enough to call a kingdom. It was a handful of strongholds in a city that had decided it was time for a new ruler. Some men would take that as a sign to run. Eamon, even now, wasn't one of them. He wasn't blind to the danger, but pride, or perhaps stubbornness, kept him rooted. The Northside was his. If they wanted it, they'd have to take it from him. And he suspected, with a calm that surprised even himself, that they just might try before the winter was done. The first days of January 2010 were bitter in Dublin, the kind of cold that seemed to creep into the bones and linger. Streets glistened with frost in the early mornings, and the air in the north side carried a sharpness that made every breath feel like an intake of glass. For most people, the turn of the year brought optimism, new resolutions, fresh starts, the illusion of time as a clean slate. For Eamon Dunne, it was just another date on a calendar he was beginning to suspect might not stretch much further. He spent New Year's Eve in a subdued fashion, tucked away in a safe apartment with only 2 men he trusted enough to share the night with. They kept the television low, the blinds drawn, and the drinks measured. Outside, fireworks painted the sky in fleeting bursts of color. But inside, the mood was taut, the laughter thin. Even in this private space, Eamon caught himself glancing toward the door, listening for sounds beyond the hum of the fridge and the muffled television. In the first week of the new year, his paranoia found justification. A close associate, one of the men who handled mid-level collections, was found beaten and dumped in an alley off Dorset Street. He survived, barely, but refused to say who had done it. Whether out of loyalty or fear, Eamon couldn't be sure. The message was clearer than any confession. The perimeter was shrinking, and those who worked for him were no longer untouchable. The Gardaí had also sharpened their pursuit. Surveillance cars became a more common sight, their plain panels and unmarked grills still carrying that subtle, unmistakable official presence. He spotted one outside a cafe where he met an old school friend. Another was parked 2 streets down from a lockup he hadn't visited in months. It was as if they wanted him to see them now. Psychological pressure, tightening the vice without even making an arrest. One of his old contacts from the port, a man with decades of experience moving cargo quietly, invited him for coffee in Howth. Over steaming mugs, the man leaned in and told him straight, "They're letting it happen, Eamon. They're letting the wolves circle you. No one's pulling them back this time." It wasn't a plea, nor an offer of help, just a statement of fact, delivered with the weary tone of someone who'd seen the cycle play out before. February brought more frost, but also more fractures. A shipment through Spain, meant to reassert his presence on the supply lines, never made it past customs. Eamon had paid well for assurances that it would glide through untouched, but assurances are only as strong as the loyalty of those who give them. That failure cost him money, yes, but more than that, it cost him face. Rivals began openly discussing his decline in public spaces, something that would have been unthinkable even a year earlier. In mid-February, he took a rare step, meeting with one of the newer players who'd been making moves on the Northside. The younger man was slick, dressed in designer from shoes to cufflinks, and he came alone. They sat in a private booth at a restaurant that still welcomed Eamon with discreet warmth. The conversation was polite, even respectful, but the subtext was unmistakable. The young man was positioning himself as the inevitable future, and Eamon as the relic. There was no offer of partnership, only a thinly veiled suggestion that Eamon might consider stepping back gracefully. Eamon left without shaking his hand. Outside, the city felt colder than the winter could account for. By March, it wasn't just whispers. There were sightings. Rivals seen in bars and clubs once considered part of his circuit, openly courting the very people who had been fixtures in his crew. A few of his men defected outright, slipping away without explanation, their numbers erased from his phone. It was a slow erosion, but one that left unmistakable gaps in his operation, and yet he still had moments where the old life flickered back to life. A night in late March saw him in a pub near the docks, surrounded by a small but loyal group, the air thick with cigarette smoke and laughter. They spoke of old scores, of nights when the streets seemed to belong entirely to them. For a few hours, it felt as if nothing had changed. But then, on the walk back to his car, he noticed a figure leaning against a wall in the shadows, a man he didn't recognize, smoking slowly, watching without pretending otherwise. April arrived with rain, as if the city itself wanted to wash something away. Eamon moved more cautiously than ever, changing his schedule daily, never lingering in the same place. Still, there was an inevitability in the way events were unfolding. He could sense it in the glances exchanged in pubs, the sudden silences when he walked into a room. On April 23rd, he attended a friend's birthday party at a pub in Cabra. The gathering was lively, filled with familiar faces, the kind of event where he could almost convince himself he was still in control. But as the night went on, a restlessness settled in him. He stayed longer than he should have, talking and laughing, ignoring the quiet warning at the back of his mind. When he finally stepped outside, the street was calm, the air damp with the faint scent of rain. He walked toward his car, keys in hand, and that's when it happened. Sudden, efficient, and final. The sound came first, sharp cracks slicing through the night air, followed by the chaos of shouts and running feet. Eamon Dunne, the Don of Dublin's Northside, fell in the street, the world he had ruled already receding into history. The days that followed were filled with headlines and speculation. Some called it the inevitable end of a man who had risen too high, too fast. Others spoke of betrayal from within, of debts called in by unseen hands. The truth, as always, was tangled in the kind of knots that the city rarely bothered to untie. His funeral drew a crowd that was part mourning, part spectacle. Old associates came in dark suits, their faces unreadable. The gardaí watched from a distance, noting who embraced whom, who kept apart. In the Northside, some people spoke his name with a kind of reverence, others with relief. But all agreed on one thing. His time had left a mark, and so the streets moved on, as they always do. The pubs stayed open, the docks stayed busy, and new names began to fill the spaces he'd once occupied. In the end, Eamon Dunne's reign was both a warning and a legend, a reminder of how quickly power can shift in a city that has never been short of men willing to claim it. The night after his funeral, Dublin seemed to exhale. Rain drifted in soft sheets over the leafy, turning the streetlights into blurred halos. Somewhere in the distance, a late bus rumbled past, the sound muffled as if wrapped in cloth. The Northside pub still poured pints, still hummed with conversation. But the name that had once been spoken with a mixture of fear and admiration was already slipping into the lower register, becoming something murmured rather than declared. In the quiet, you could almost feel the city's rhythm adjusting, like a tide that has lost one of its larger waves, smoothing itself out before the next swell arrives. The men who had stood beside him would find new allegiances. Those who had opposed him would fill their glasses and toast in private, careful not to seem too pleased. And the people in between, the shopkeepers, the night shift drivers, the women who worked behind the bar, would mark the change only in the subtle shifts of who walked the streets and when. Somewhere, a light in a flat window flickered off, the shadow inside moving away to another room. A car passed, tires hissing on wet tarmac, then silence again. It was the kind of night where the city felt older than its bricks, older than any of the men who had claimed to run it. If you listened closely, past the rain and the low hum of electricity in the wires, you might almost hear it, the faint echo of laughter from another time, the muted clink of a glass, the shuffle of footsteps fading into the dark. They were pieces of a story now, scattered through streets that would forget the details, but remember the shape of the man who had once walked them. And so the city sleeps and waits.